In the grim darkness of the far future, there are 10,000 ways for hope to die. But on this day, something impossible stirred in the warp, and hope remembered how to speak. Across 1,000,000 battlefields, in 1,000,000,000 prayers whispered to the golden throne, humanity had forgotten that once, long ago, their ancestors understood suffering with such clarity that they could map its very geography. They had forgotten that a man named Dante Alighieri once walked through hell itself and returned with a guidebook. But the warp remembers everything, and on this day it remembered Virgil. The anomaly registered first on the psychic wards of Terra itself, 17 minutes past the 13th hour. Astropaths collapsed in their choir chambers, bleeding from eyes that had seen something their minds categorized as impossible. Poetry. Not the battle hymns of the ecclesiarchy or the machine prayers of Mars, but something older, something that predated the age of strife by millennia. The Adeptus Astronomicus savants scrambled to classify the phenomenon. Their instruments detected no chaos corruption, no Xenos intrusion, no warp storm formation. What they detected was meter and rhyme flowing through the immaterium like a river through bedrock, carving channels where none should exist. If you hunger for tales of the impossible made manifest, for stories where the 41st millennium faces challenges beyond bolter and blade, then subscribe now, because what follows will reshape everything you know about the galaxy's endless war. In the Hall of Lang, deep within the Imperial Palace, where only the custodian god and high lords may tread, a figure materialized. Not through teleportation, not through warp breach, but through something the ancient texts called narrative necessity. He was dressed in robes that seemed simultaneously Roman and eternal, his face patrician and kind, his eyes carrying the weight of one who has guided souls through damnation and lived to catalogue the experience. The custodians raised their guardian spears, auramite gleaming, but their captain, a veteran of 3,000 years, felt his hands falter. He knew this face. Every child of Terra who studied the old texts knew this face. Publius Vergilius Maro, he said, his voice carrying harmonics that made the air itself seem more real. Though history remembers me as Virgil, I have been sleeping, dreaming in the spaces between words, but something has changed. Hell has grown too large, too complex, and it seems my services are required once more. The custodian captain's mind raced through protocols that had never anticipated this scenario. Identify yourself by authority of the throne. What are you? Demon? Warp construct? Some new sorcery of our enemies? Virgil smiled, and it was the saddest expression the captain had ever witnessed. I am a poet, Guardian, nothing more, nothing less, but in your age you have forgotten what that means. A poet does not merely describe reality, a true poet defines it. I once guided a Florentine through the 9 circles of the Inferno. I showed him Purgatorio's mountain and the spheres of Paradiso. I mapped suffering itself and gave it structure, gave it meaning. Your Imperium has built its own inferno, but you have lost the map. You wander in circles, repeating the same damnations without understanding their purpose.
Heresy.
One of the younger custodians breathed, but the captain raised a hand for silence. There was something in the poet's words that resonated with a truth the Imperium had spent 10,000 years trying to suppress, that perhaps humanity's suffering had lost its meaning, had become suffering for suffering's sake. "Take me to your emperor," Virgil said, and it was not a request. "I have walked through hell at the side of the greatest poet your species ever produced. It is time I walked through yours." The captain made a decision that would echo through history. He lowered his spear. "The golden throne is forbidden to all, but I know what it is forbidden to. But I also know what a soul looks like when it has been burning for 10,000 years, trapped in a prison of its own making, holding back the tides of chaos through sheer agonized will. That is not divine. That is the eighth circle, fourth Bolgia. The sorcerers and false prophets, their heads twisted backward, weeping for the future they can see but never reach." His eyes held an ancient compassion. "I have seen this before, Guardian, and I know how the story ends if no one changes the verse." The walk through the imperial palace took 3 hours. Word spread through vox channels and astropathic whispers. A figure from old Earth's myths walked among them, speaking in measured iambic pentameter that made servitors pause in their programmed routines, that caused tech priests to experience something their augmetics classified as wonder. Inquisitors scrambled to investigate, but their precognitive measures returned only blank verse. The Grey Knights prepared for demonic incursion, but their sanctified wards remained dormant. Whatever Virgil was, he existed in a category their universe had not anticipated. They passed through the Hall of Victories, where 10,000 years of conquest were carved in stone. Virgil paused at each triumph, reading them like stanzas in an epic gone wrong. Ulanor, Istivan, Cadia. He touched the inscription of "The Last Stand at Cadia" with reverence. "You even wrote it in stone. The planet broke before the guard did. This is poetry, tragic, magnificent poetry, but poetry nonetheless." He turned to the captain. "Your species still remembers how to tell stories. You have simply forgotten that stories have power beyond morale and propaganda. In the oldest days we understood. The right words, in the right order, can reshape reality itself." They reached the Sanctum Imperialis as the 14th hour struck. The massive doors, each requiring 100 servitors to open, swung wide at Virgil's approach. The custodians who had accompanied them felt it, a presence that was not the Emperor's overwhelming psychic might, but something equally ancient, equally fundamental. The poet stepped into the chamber where the master of mankind had sat imprisoned for 100 centuries, and for the first time since the Horus heresy, someone entered that room not as a supplicant, but as an equal. The golden throne pulsed with eldritch light, life support systems screaming as they channeled the psychic might of 1,000 dying souls per day into sustaining a corpse god. Virgil stood before it unafraid and spoke in a language that predated High Gothic by 28,000 years. "Hello, old friend," he said in ancient Latin. "You tried to kill the gods and became one yourself. How deliciously ironic. Shall we discuss what happens next? I believe you require a guide."
The Emperor's response was not words, but a psychic tsunami that would have reduced a lesser being to ash and screaming atoms. It crashed against Virgil like the wrath of stars, carrying 10 millennia of pain, fury, and the desperate howl of a god who never wanted godhood. The custodians threw themselves prostrate, their enhanced minds barely able to withstand the peripheral wash of their master's consciousness. But Virgil stood unmoved, and as the psychic maelstrom enveloped him, he began to recite. Per me si va nella città dolente, per me si va nell'eterno dolore, per me si va tra la perduta gente. The words emerged in clear, unshakable Florentine Italian, and impossibly the Emperor's fury lessened. Through me the way into the suffering city, through me the way to eternal pain, through me the way that runs among the lost. Virgil's voice carried harmonics that the warp itself seemed to recognize, old patterns from before humanity learned to scream in the Imperium. You know these words, don't you? Even entombed as you are, even burning for 100 centuries, you remember when humanity could face damnation and map its borders. The golden light flickered, pulsed, and then, impossibly, the Emperor spoke. Not through the Astronomican's choir, not through the thunder of divine will, but in a voice that sounded almost human, almost tired. What are you? The words bypassed sound entirely, manifesting as pure meaning in the minds of all present. I am what you forgot to become, Virgil replied, approaching the throne with the ease of one who has walked through worse hells than this. You made yourself a warrior, a king, an immortal tyrant wrapped in good intentions, but you forgot the power of the poet, the guide, the one who walks beside the suffering and gives their pain structure and meaning. He gestured at the endless machinery, the life support systems, the psychic wards that held back the tides of chaos. This is the 8th circle, 4th Bolgia. You can see the future, but cannot reach it. Your head is twisted backward by your own prophecy, and you weep tears of blood for the species you tried to save and condemned instead. Heresy, but the word lacked conviction. Truth, Virgil countered. You united Terra under the banner of imperial truth. No gods, no superstition, only reason and science. And in doing so, you created the greatest irony in human history. You became the very thing you denied could exist, and your sons either betrayed you or worship you, neither path the one you intended. He placed a hand on the corroded armrest of the golden throne, and the ancient machinery shuddered. But I did not come to judge you, old friend. I came because hell has grown too large, and someone must guide humanity through it. You tried force, you tried empire. Perhaps it is time to try understanding. The chamber fell silent, except for the rhythmic pulse of the throne's machinery. 1,000 souls per day screaming through psychic conduits to fuel the corpse god's endless vigil. Virgil listened to that sound with the air of a conductor hearing an orchestra play out of tune. This will not do, he said finally. You are burning souls without teaching them why they burn. There is no redemption here, no progression, no journey, only fuel and consumption. Even Dante's Inferno had a purpose. Each circle taught a lesson. Each punishment matched the sin. And at the center, Lucifer himself was trapped in ice, unable to corrupt further. Your hell simply devours. The Astronomican must burn. Without it, humanity falls. The warp will consume everything. Yes, Virgil agreed, but there are better ways to burn, more efficient verses. You have forgotten that the warp responds to narrative, to meaning, to the old power of words spoken with perfect understanding. He turned to face the throne fully, his eyes meeting the empty sockets behind the golden death mask. What if I told you that hell itself could be restructured? That the 9 circles I once mapped were not arbitrary, but fundamental patterns that even chaos must acknowledge. The warp is not truly chaotic. It is reactive, shaped by consciousness and belief. And consciousness, properly guided, can be taught to believe in structure.
The Emperor's presence pressed against Virgil's mind, testing, probing, searching for deception or corruption. What it found was something unprecedented, a human consciousness so old, so refined by its singular purpose that it had become conceptual. Virgil was not merely a soul or a warp entity. He was an idea made manifest, the idea that suffering could be understood, catalogued, and therefore transcended. You died 3,000 years before my birth, the Emperor projected. How are you here? Poetry never dies, Virgil said simply. It sleeps in the spaces between words, in the collective memory of every human who ever read the Commedia and understood that hell was not random cruelty, but divine justice. When Dante Alighieri wrote his Divine Comedy, he did not merely describe the afterlife, he defined it. His vision became so integral to human consciousness that it shaped the warp itself, creating structures that endure even when forgotten. He smiled that sad smile again. I was his guide once, his psychopomp through the underworld. And when humanity needed me again, when hell grew too complex and the map was lost, I awoke. Because that is what guides do. Prove it, the Emperor commanded. Show me this power you claim. Restructure my hell, poet, and I will listen. Virgil nodded slowly. Very well, but understand, what I am about to do cannot be undone. Once the warp recognizes these patterns, once chaos itself acknowledges the structure of the 9 circles, reality will shift. Your Imperium will face a choice: continue wandering aimlessly through suffering, or begin the journey upward, through purgation, toward paradise. He raised his hands, and his voice took on the cadence of ancient verse. I will need your permission. Even a guide cannot drag a soul through revelation unwillingly. The golden throne pulsed, and the custodian captain felt his master's consciousness expand, encompassing the chamber, the palace, perhaps the entire planet. For 10,000 years the Emperor had held humanity together through sheer tyrannical will, forbidding hope, demanding only sacrifice. Now, for the first time since the Horus heresy, he was being offered an alternative. Show me, the Emperor said, and the words carried the weight of a civilization's desperate prayer. Virgil closed his eyes and began to recite. The words were Italian, Latin, and something older, perhaps the language of human suffering itself. As he spoke, the warp around Terra began to shift, and in the Imperium, daemons paused their eternal games of torment and looked up in confusion. Something was changing, something fundamental. Reality itself was remembering an older pattern, and even the chaos gods felt it, a structure asserting itself where only madness should reign. The poet's voice grew stronger, and the custodians watched in awe as the golden light of the throne began to pulse in perfect iambic pentameter, matching the rhythm of Virgil's verse. This was not sorcery. This was something far more dangerous. This was truth, spoken with such clarity that even lies had to acknowledge it. The transformation began in the space between heartbeats, in the quantum moment where thought becomes reality and reality bends to narrative. Virgil's words rippled outward from Terra like stones cast into an infinite ocean, and the warp, that roiling sea of emotion and madness, suddenly remembered it had once possessed geometry. The poet's voice rose and fell in measured cadence, each syllable a chisel stroke against the formless chaos, each verse a line drawn in the immaterium that even daemons could not cross without acknowledging. "You see it now, don't you?" Virgil said, his eyes still closed, his consciousness expanding through dimensions the Mechanicum would spend centuries trying to quantify. "Your Imperium already contains all 9 circles. You built them without realizing. The hive cities where billions labor in darkness. Limbo, where the virtuous unbaptized dwell without hope of salvation. Your penal legions and death worlds. The second circle, where the lustful are swept in eternal storms of violence. Your worlds consumed by endless war. The third circle, where the gluttonous drown in their own excess." The Emperor's presence pressed closer, and Virgil felt the vast intelligence examining his words, searching for the trap, the corruption, the inevitable betrayal. But there was none. Only truth, spoken in verse older than the Imperium itself. The fourth circle, your administratum, where greed and waste battle eternally over resources while nothing changes. The fifth, your hive gangs and undercities, where the wrathful tear at each other in perpetual fury. The sixth, your heretics, burning in the pyres of the Inquisition. The seventh, Virgil's voice grew heavy. Your endless wars, where the violent boil in rivers of blood they themselves have spilled. And the 8th and 9th? The Emperor's question carried genuine curiosity now, a spark of the scientist he had once been before godhood consumed him. "The 8th circle is where you sit, master of mankind." Virgil opened his eyes, and they held depths that made even custodians look away. "The fraudulent, the deceivers, those who saw the truth and chose to shape it into lies for what they believed was the greater good. You told humanity there were no gods while becoming one. You promised reason and delivered faith. You are Malebolge incarnate, 10 ditches of ever-deepening deception." The chamber should have erupted in violence at such words. The custodians should have struck Virgil down where he stood. But they could not move, because every warrior in that room, every soul who had served the Imperium for centuries, knew in their deepest heart that the poet spoke truth. "And the 9th circle," Virgil continued, his voice dropping to barely a whisper, "is where your son Horus fell. Treachery, the betrayal of those closest to you. The 9th circle is ice, not fire. Cold calculation, the murder of love itself. Judas, Brutus, Cassius, and in your version, Horus, Lorgar, Fulgrim, and all the rest who bit the hand that shaped them." The Emperor's psychic presence shuddered, and for a moment the custodian captain thought his master might strike Virgil down despite the truth of his words. But instead, something unprecedented happened. The Emperor laughed. It was a bitter, hollow sound that echoed through both real space and the warp, and on distant worlds astropaths wept without knowing why. "So I have built hell without meaning to," the Emperor projected. "I tried to drag humanity into the light and created only a more elaborate damnation. Is that your assessment, poet?" "Not an assessment," Virgil corrected gently, "an observation. But here is what you have forgotten in your 10,000 years of suffering. The Divine Comedy did not end in hell. Dante journeyed through Inferno, yes, but then he climbed Purgatorio and ascended to Paradiso. Damnation is not destiny. It is a stage, a lesson, a necessary suffering that leads to transcendence. Your hell has no exit because you have forgotten that suffering should have a purpose beyond mere endurance." The poet began to walk around the golden throne, and the custodians tracked him with their eyes but did not intervene. There was something happening here beyond their protocols, beyond their oaths. They were witnessing theology being rewritten in real time. "The warp responds to belief," Virgil said, trailing his fingers along the psychic conduits that fed the Astronomican. "For 10,000 years, humanity has believed in endless war, in suffering without redemption, in a galaxy where there is only the Emperor's cold light or the daemon's seductive darkness. What if they believed differently? What if the Imperium's countless souls understood that their suffering was not meaningless, that each circle of hell was a lesson to be learned, a sin to be purged, a step on the journey towards something better?" "They would call it heresy," the Emperor replied. "The ecclesiarchy would burn you. The Inquisition would declare exterminatus on any world that listened." "Yes," Virgil agreed, "because you built an empire on a foundation of absolute certainty, and certainty is the death of transformation. But I have walked through hell before, old friend. I know what happens when you try to trap souls in eternal stasis. They corrupt. They fester. Even the virtuous, denied hope and growth, eventually turn to despair or madness. Your Imperium is not holding back chaos. It is creating more of it, one tortured soul at a time." The machinery around the golden throne began to hum at frequencies that should not exist. Tech priests in the deep forges of Mars looked up from their prayers as their instruments registered impossible harmonics, songs in binary that spoke of transformation, of sacred geometry, of mathematical poetry that made their augmetic hearts race with something disturbingly close to hope. "Watch," Virgil said, and he raised his hand toward the chamber ceiling, toward the distant stars beyond Terra's atmosphere. "Let me show you what happens when hell recognizes its own structure." In the warp, something shifted. The great ocean, that roiling chaos of human emotion and demonic malice, suddenly developed a texture it had never possessed. Navigators across the galaxy screamed as they saw it, concentric circles appearing in the Imperium, vast and perfect, each one containing specific types of suffering, specific patterns of sin and damnation. The warp was organizing itself, not into the crude fourfold division of the Chaos Gods, but into 9 precise layers, each with its own rules, its own logic, its own potential for transcendence. A demon of Tzeentch, manifesting in the outer reaches of Segmentum Obscurus, found itself suddenly constrained. Its form, previously fluid and ever-changing, locked into a configuration determined by its nature: deceiver, manipulator, architect of lies. It tried to shift, to escape the pattern, but the pattern held. Because patterns, once recognized by enough consciousness, become laws. And Virgil had just reminded the entire galaxy what pattern hell followed. "It's spreading," the custodian captain whispered, his psychic wards showing him glimpses of the transformation. Across the galaxy, every human mind is feeling it. They're remembering something they never knew. They're remembering the map, Virgil corrected. Every child who ever heard a story about heaven and hell, every soul who wondered if their suffering had meaning, every warrior who hoped that dying for the emperor might lead somewhere beyond endless war, they all carried fragments of the divine comedy in their unconscious. I have simply made those fragments conscious again. The Emperor's presence expanded, examining the changes, calculating the implications. This was either the greatest act of salvation humanity had ever received, or the most subtle corruption ever devised. But the Master of Mankind had not survived 40,000 years by refusing to adapt. "What have you done?" he asked, and the question carried not anger, but genuine wonder. "I have given your hell an exit sign, and tomorrow I will show your Imperium what Purgatorio looks like. But first," he turned back to face the golden throne directly, "you must decide whether you want to remain frozen in the ninth circle or begin the climb upward. Even guides cannot drag the unwilling toward paradise." The demon materialized in the Sanctum Imperialis 63 seconds after Virgil's restructuring rippled across the Immaterium. It came not through ritual or summoning, but through sheer indignant necessity. A greater demon of Tzeentch, its form a kaleidoscope of impossible angles and colors that should not exist, its 9 eyes blazing with the fury of entropy denied. The custodians moved instantly, Bardian spears ignited with psychic fire, but Virgil simply raised one hand in a gesture of patient correction. "Wait," the poet said. "This one comes not to attack, but to understand. Don't you, architect of fate?" The demon's form rippled with barely contained rage, its voice emerging from 17 mouths simultaneously, each speaking a different language yet somehow comprehensible. "What have you done, poet thing? What have you done to the great ocean? There are patterns now, structures, limitations." The last word emerged as a shriek that shattered 3 stained glass windows depicting the Emperor's victories. "We are change incarnate. We are possibility. We cannot be constrained by meter and rhyme." Virgil smiled, and it was the expression of a teacher watching a student grasp the lesson too late. "But you already were constrained, weren't you? You simply didn't realize it. Tell me, demon, what is your nature?" The creature's form twisted, folded, became temporarily a spiral of living text written in languages that predated humanity. "I am deception. I am the lie that reveals truth. I am the scheme within the scheme, the plot that plots itself, the 8th circle, 4th Bolgia. Sorcerers and diviners, those who twisted truth to see the future and were punished with heads turned backward, forced to walk forward while looking behind, weeping for what they foresaw but could not prevent." He stepped toward the demon, utterly unafraid. "You are not chaos, creature. You have never been chaos. You are the sin of fraudulent prophecy given form and consciousness. Tzeentch, your master, is the personification of the 8th Circle's denizens. And now that the galaxy remembers this truth, you are bound by it." The demon tried to attack. Its form exploded into 1,000 shrieking birds of change, each one carrying plagues that could unmake reality. But as they flew toward Virgil, something impossible happened. They froze mid-air in a moment of perfect poetic meter. The poet had not raised a weapon or spoken a word. He had simply existed with such certainty about the demon's nature that reality agreed with him. "You see," Virgil said softly, reaching out to touch one of the frozen birds. It shivered at his contact, but could not move. "I know what you are. I have catalogued your sin, placed you in your proper circle, assigned you your proper punishment. And because I have done this with the authority of one who mapped hell itself, even you must acknowledge the pattern. This is not psychic might. This is not faith or imperial truth. This is older, the power of names spoken truly, of definitions that cannot be argued against because they are fundamentally correct." The demon's many voices merged into one, and for the first time in its existence, it spoke with something approaching fear. "You are making the warp knowable, mappable. If humanity can chart damnation, they can navigate it, they can escape it." "Yes," Virgil agreed. "That is precisely what I am doing. For 10,000 years the Chaos Gods have maintained power through humanity's ignorance of their own damnation. You convinced mortals that corruption was inevitable, that the warp was unknowable, that fighting chaos was like fighting the ocean. But oceans can be navigated, demon. Hell can be traversed. I proved this when I guided Dante Alighieri through all 9 circles and out the other side into Purgatorio, and I will prove it again." The Emperor's presence pressed forward, examining the frozen demon with the intensity of a scientist observing a new species. "It cannot move. Not because of force, but because it recognizes your authority over its own nature." "How?" "Because I understand it," Virgil explained, still standing within arm's reach of the demon that should have killed him instantly. "Chaos is not truly chaotic. It is humanity's sins and vices given eternal life in the warp. Tzeentch is deceit and false prophecy. Khorne is wrath and violence. Nurgle is despair and stagnation. Slaanesh is excess and perversion. These are not unknowable alien forces. These are human sins I catalogued 800 years before the birth of Christ. They have simply grown to godlike proportions because humanity forgot what they were." The demon's form began to compress, folding in on itself as the pattern Virgil had established took hold. "No," it whispered from collapsing mouths. "No, this is not. We are eternal. We are—" "You are predictable," Virgil said, and there was pity in his voice. "That is the secret you most feared having revealed, that for all your talk of infinite change and possibility, you follow the same patterns humanity has followed since we first learned to lie. The same frauds, the same schemes, the same betrayals, repeated endlessly in the warp like echoes in a canyon." He turned to the Emperor. "This is what your imperial truth missed. You tried to deny the gods' existence, which only gave them power through humanity's need to rebel against denial. But if you had instead named them truly, defined them precisely, shown humanity that these were not gods but sin personified, then you would have given your species weapons no bolter could match." The custodian captain found his voice, his oath of silence broken by sheer necessity. "My lord, is this possible? Can damnation truly be so simple?" "Not simple," Virgil corrected. "Structured. There is a vast difference. The 9 circles of hell are not easy to traverse. Dante nearly failed a dozen times, nearly gave in to despair or corruption. But he had a map. He had a guide. He knew that even in the deepest pit of the 9th circle, where Satan himself was trapped in ice, there was still a passage through. At the very center of damnation, where all evil converged, there was the point from which one could begin climbing upward. The demon had compressed now to the size of a human, its form no longer abstract but specific, a robed figure with its head twisted backward, weeping from eyes that saw only the past while walking into an uncertain future. It was still a demon, still dangerous, still immortal, but it was also defined, known, and therefore defeatable. "What have you done to me?" it asked, and the voice was almost pitiful. "I have given you your true name," Virgil said. "You are Malabald's child, fourth ditch, sorcerer unrepentant. That is what you are, what you have always been, and what you will be until either you accept transformation or are destroyed by those who understand your nature." He turned to the Emperor. "This is what your imperial truth missed. You tried to deny the gods' existence, which only gave them power through humanity's need to rebel against denial. But if you had instead named them truly, defined them precisely, shown humanity that these were not gods but sin personified, then you would have given your species weapons no bolter could match." The demon took a stumbling step backward, its form flickering between the abstract horror it had been and the punishment it had become. "The architect will not forgive this. Tzeentch will do what Tzeentch has always done. He will scheme and plot and deceive. But now humanity will know which circle those schemes originate from, and what punishments await those who indulge them. Your master has not been destroyed, demon. He has been understood, and understanding is the first step to either resistance or transcendence." With a final shriek that sounded almost like laughter, the demon vanished, pulled back into the warp by his master's will. But something had changed. The Sanctum Imperialis felt different, as if the air itself had become more certain, more structured. The infinite possibilities of chaos had narrowed just slightly into knowable patterns. The custodian captain fell to one knee, not in worship, but in exhaustion from what he had witnessed. If this spreads, if every demon can be named and understood, if hell itself has become a map rather than a maze, then humanity finally has a fighting chance, Virgil finished. Not to win the eternal war, that was never possible, but to understand what they are fighting, why they are fighting, and where the battle leads. That is all any soul can ask for. That is what I gave Dante, and what I now give your species." The Emperor's presence receded slightly, the golden light of the throne pulsing with new rhythms, new possibilities, and in the depths of the warp, Tzeentch screamed in fury as 10,000 schemes unraveled, their complexity rendered useless by the simple act of being truly understood. The restructuring of the warp accelerated throughout the following hours, spreading from terror like concentric waves of enforced meaning. Virgil stood at the heart of the Sanctum Imperialis and spoke verses that had not been uttered in their original context for 38,000 years. Each stanza another nail driven into chaos's claim of infinite unpredictability. The Emperor watched through his prison of golden light and dying souls, and for the first time since Horus's betrayal, he allowed himself to experience something dangerously close to hope. "Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai per una selva oscura, che la diritta via era smarrita," Virgil recited, his voice carrying harmonics that made the walls of reality itself resonate. "Midway upon the journey of our life, I found myself within a forest dark, for the straightforward pathway had been lost. He opened his eyes and looked directly at where the Emperor's consciousness burned. Humanity is midway through its journey, 40,000 years from birth to now, and if you survive, perhaps 40,000 more ahead. But you have lost the straightforward path. You wander in darkness, and the only lights you see are either my pyre or the enemy's seduction. There is a third way, the path of understanding. The words resonated not just in the chamber, but throughout the Imperium. On distant worlds, in the depths of warp storms, in the twisted corridors of demon ships, the entities of chaos felt their very substance shift. The warp had always been emotion given form, thought made manifest, but it had been formless emotion, chaotic thought. Now it was remembering structure, and structure meant limitation. In the formless wastes where Tzeentch's tower of infinite stairs twisted through impossible geometries, the architect of fate felt his domain shudder. His tower was collapsing, not into ruin, but into specificity. The infinite stairs were becoming 9 distinct levels, each corresponding to a subdivision of fraud and malice. His demons, his schemes, his labyrinthine plots, all of them suddenly sorting themselves into categories they could not escape. "No," Tzeentch whispered with 9,000 voices, each speaking a different lie. "This is not. I am change itself. I cannot be." But he could be, because Virgil had named him truly. The architect of fate was not change incarnate, but rather the specific sin of fraudulent knowledge, of schemes built on deception, of futures promised that were always lies. He was the 8th Circle's master, the king of Melbolge's 10 ditches, and now that humanity remembered this truth, even a chaos god could not fully deny it. Back in the Sanctum Imperialis, Virgil continued his recitation. But now the verses were not Dante's, they were new cantos, written in real time as the poet observed the Imperial's particular damnation and mapped it according to divine principles. The custodians listened, their enhanced memories recording every word for later analysis, for theological debates that would span centuries. In the first circle stands limbo vast and wide, where augury worlds and factorum hide. The virtuous unbaptized who knew not the creed, they labor endless without hope's sweet seed. No torture here, no flame, no demon's touch, just grinding work that asks forever much. The Emperor's children, loyal and true, damned only by ignorance of what they're due. The verses rippled outward, and on 10,000 worlds where humans toiled in factories they would never leave, where generations lived and died, never knowing the sky, something shifted. They felt their suffering acknowledged, categorized, given meaning within a larger structure. They were not merely slaves or resources. They were the First Circle's inhabitants, and First Circles could be escaped. One had only to learn, to understand, to climb. In the Second Circle, storms of war eternal blow, where soldiers die in battles they cannot know. The lustful for violence, addicted to the fight, swept in tempests of blood through endless night. From Armageddon's ash to Cadia's fall, warriors spiral in their violent thrall. On battlefields across the galaxy, Imperial guardsmen felt it, that shift in understanding. They were not just dying for the Emperor, they were trapped in the Second Circle, swept up in humanity's addiction to violence, and violence, like all sins, could be understood, resisted, transcended. Some would die in that circle, yes, but others might learn to fight without lust for battle, to kill without love of killing, and in so doing begin their climb upward. The Emperor's presence pressed against Virgil's consciousness, not in attack, but in desperate question. You are giving my soldiers reasons to question their duty. You are planting seeds of doubt in minds that must remain certain to survive. No, Virgil replied without pausing his recitation. I am giving them reasons to transform their duty. A soldier who fights from lust for battle will fall to Khorne eventually. A soldier who fights from understanding of necessity, who kills without desire for killing, who serves without losing their humanity, that soldier transcends the second circle even while walking through it. Your Imperium has confused mindless obedience with virtue. I am teaching the difference. He continued through the circles, each verse more specific, each stanza mapping another aspect of imperial damnation onto the divine structure. The third circle became the hive nobility drowning in excess while their people starved. The fourth circle became the administratum's endless hoarding and waste, where resources rotted in warehouses while worlds died of deprivation. The fifth circle became the underhives, where gangs tore at each other in perpetual wrath. But when Virgil reached the sixth circle, his voice changed, became heavier, more sorrowful. In the sixth circle, heretics burn bright, in the Inquisition's pyres through endless night. But who are the heretics, the faithless, the lost, those who question the Emperor whatever the cost? Red-hot tombs of flame await them all, but is their sin damnation, or hearing truth's call? The custodian captain stiffened. You cannot question the Inquisition's holy work. They root out corruption. They save humanity from asking questions, from seeking truth beyond dogma, from wondering if perhaps the Emperor's design contained flaws that mortals might correct. He turned to face the captain fully. Tell me, Guardian, if your Emperor could speak freely, without the constraints of worship and faith, what would he say about the Inquisition burning scholars who studied Zeno's philosophy? What would he say about worlds destroyed because they discovered archaeological evidence contradicting the Ecclesiastes' teachings? The captain had no answer, because he knew, deep in his genetically perfected heart, that the master of mankind had valued knowledge above all else, had spent millennia gathering humanity's wisdom before the age of strife, had probably damned himself precisely by trying to control what truth humanity could access. The sixth circle, the Emperor projected quietly, is not for heretics, but for those who imprisoned thought itself. Is that what you are saying, poet? The tombs burn not for those inside them, but for those who sealed them shut. Dante saw heretics suffering in their hot graves, yes, but the real sin was the rejection of divine truth in favor of false doctrine. In your Imperium, which is the heresy, questioning the Emperor's godhood or insisting he must be worshipped as a god when he specifically forbade it? The question hung in the air like a sword suspended by a thread. The custodians waited for their master to reject this obvious heresy, to command Virgil's destruction for such blasphemy. Instead, the Emperor's laughter echoed again, both in real space and the warp. Bitter, exhausted, and achingly honest. Continue your mapping, poet, the Emperor commanded. Let us see how deep my hell truly goes. So Virgil spoke of the seventh circle, where the violent boiled in rivers of blood. The Imperium's endless wars of conquest, where violence against others, against self, and against the divine order itself played out across 1,000,000 battlefields. He spoke of the 8th circle's 10 ditches, each one a different species of fraud that the Imperium practiced daily. Panderers, flatterers, simoniacs, false prophets, barrators, hypocrites, thieves, evil counselors, sowers of discord, and falsifiers. By the time he finished, even the custodians understood that he was not describing hypothetical sins, but cataloguing the Imperium's daily operations. And then he reached the 9th circle, and his voice dropped to barely a whisper. "The 9th circle is ice, not flame," Virgil said. "Treachery so cold it freezes even hell itself. In the first ring, Caina, those who betrayed family, Horus, who slew his father's dream. In the second, Antonora, those who betrayed country, the traitor primarchs who damned humanity. In the third, Plotemia, those who betrayed guests and friends, every chapter that turned from their oaths. And in the center, Judeca, his voice broke slightly, Judeca, where those who betrayed their lords are frozen in the ice around Satan himself." "You say my son is trapped there?" the Emperor projected, "in the center of the 9th circle, frozen with Judas and Brutus?" "I say he belongs there," Virgil corrected gently. "Whether he remains there is another question entirely, because even from the 9th circle there is a passage, at the very center of hell, where all evil converges. Dante and I found the way through. We climbed down Satan's frozen body, through the center of the earth, and emerged on the other side to see the stars again, and begin our ascent of Mount Purgatory." The words resonated through the warp with finality, and across the galaxy 1,000,000,000,000 human souls felt it. The map was complete. Hell had been charted, its borders defined, its circles named, and most importantly, its exit had been located. In the eye of terror, Abaddon the Despoiler stumbled in his throne room, clutching his head as understanding he did not want forced itself into his consciousness. He was 9th circle, first ring, Caina, betrayer of family. And if there was a map, if there was a structure, then perhaps there was also a way out. The thought terrified him more than any daemon ever had. The reverberations of Virgil's mapping reached the furthest corners of the Imperium within 6 days. It was not psychic transmission, nor astropathic message, but something far more insidious, a shift in the collective unconscious of humanity itself. Imperial commanders who had never heard of Dante Alighieri found themselves instinctively understanding that their wars followed patterns, that their strategies could be categorized, that the chaos they fought was not formless, but followed the ancient geometry of sin. Lord Commander Militant Artemius Cain of the Cadian 203rd stood in the strategium of his flagship, the Unbreakable Bulwark, and stared at the hololithic display of the warp storm they were preparing to navigate. His entire career had been built on the principle that chaos was unknowable, that warp storms were forces of nature to be endured rather than understood. But now, looking at the roiling madness displayed before him, he saw something different. Patterns, concentric circles, specific types of corruption arranged in a hierarchy that suddenly made terrible sense. "Navigator," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had just had his entire worldview restructured. "Tell me what you see." Navigator Yevena emerged from her meditation chamber, her third eye concealed beneath its customary bandana. She had been screaming for 3 days straight as the warp transformed around her, as the formless ocean she had spent centuries learning to navigate suddenly developed topology. When she spoke, her voice was hoarse but certain. "I see hell, Lord Commander. 9 distinct layers, each with its own tides and currents. The outer layers are passable, limbo, where the lost souls drift without purpose, the lustful storms of the second circle, the filth of the third. But deeper," she shuddered, "deeper the currents grow more dangerous, more specific. We have always navigated by feel and faith, but now there is a map. Someone has given the warp a map." Kane nodded slowly. "Can you use it?" "Use it?" Yevena laughed, and it was the sound of relief bordering on hysteria. "Lord Commander, for the first time in my bloodline's 10,000 years of service, I understand what I am navigating through. Yes, I can use it, but more than that, I can teach others to use it. The warp is no longer unknowable, it is merely hell, and hell can be traversed if one knows the way." Across the Imperium, similar conversations were taking place. Mars priests of Mecca found their machine spirits responding to prayers structured in terzarima, the interlocking 3-line stanzas that Dante had used in his original Commedia. Inquisitors discovered that daemons bound by their true names, their circle assignments, their specific sins were far easier to banish than those approached as formless chaos. And in the training halls of the Schola Progenium, instructors found themselves teaching cadets not just to hate the enemy, but to understand which circle each enemy represented, and therefore how to fight them most effectively. But it was on the cathedral world of Ophelia VII that the most profound change occurred. Cardinal Matthias the Uncompromising stood before the assembled synod of cardinals, his face contorted with a rage so pure it bordered on religious ecstasy. "Heresy!" he thundered, his voice amplified by the cathedral's perfect acoustics. "This poet Damon claims to map the emperor's divine will. He suggests that our Holy Inquisition burns those who seek truth. He implies that the God Emperor's design contains flaws that mortals might correct. This is corruption of the highest order." But Cardinal Serafina, the merciful, ancient and bent with age, raised one trembling hand for silence. When she spoke, her voice was soft, but carried the authority of one who had served the ecclesiarchy for 3 centuries. "And yet," she said, "the poet speaks of circles, of structure, of divine comedy rather than divine tragedy. Tell me, Matthias, have you read the verses he recites? They are not chaos-tainted. They carry no corruption. They speak of sin and punishment, of justice and eventual redemption. Are these not the core principles of our faith?" "He questions the Inquisition," Matthias spat. "He suggests heretics might be justified in their questioning." "No," Serafina corrected gently. "He suggests that those who imprison thought itself might be the true heretics. And having spent 3 centuries watching the Inquisition burn philosophers and scholars, having witnessed the destruction of libraries and the purging of archaeological sites that contradicted official doctrine, I find it difficult to argue against his assessment." The chamber erupted in chaos. Half the assembled cardinals roared their support for Matthias, demanding that this poet Damon be declared anathema, that his verses be banned, that worlds be purged to prevent the spread of his dangerous ideas. But the other half, led by Serafina, argued that understanding the structure of damnation was not heresy, but the highest form of spiritual warfare. The debate raged for 17 hours before a message arrived that silenced them all. It came not through astropathic choir or vox transmission, but written in light across the cathedral's stained glass windows, projected there by no technology anyone could identify. The words appeared in High Gothic, perfect and undeniable.
The throne has spoken. The poet's wisdom is acknowledged. Hell has been mapped. Now we climb. The cathedral fell silent, because everyone in that chamber knew the only source that could project words with such authority, that could bypass every defense and ward to write directly in the Emperor's light. The God Emperor himself had rendered judgment, and his judgment was clear. Virgil's restructuring of the warp was not heresy, but divine revelation. Back on Terra, in the Sanctum Imperial, Virgil lowered his hands from where they had been raised toward the distant cathedral world. The Emperor's psychic might had been channeled through him, used to write in light across the galaxy. It had been exhausting, but necessary. "Your children needed to know," Virgil explained, his voice tired. "They needed to understand that this transformation has your blessing, however reluctant. Without that, half the Imperium would have declared civil war trying to resist the changes." "You use my power as if it were your own," the Emperor observed, but there was no anger in the projection. "I use it as any guide uses the tools at hand, a torch to light the way, a rope to secure the passage. Your power is vast, old friend, but it has been trapped for too long in maintaining rather than transforming. Now it can be both, holding back the tide of chaos while simultaneously teaching humanity to navigate it." The custodian captain, who had not left his post despite days without sleep or sustenance, finally asked the question that had been building in his mind. "What comes next, poet? You have mapped hell, restructured the warp, given daemons their true names, but mapping is not the same as escaping. How do we climb out?" Virgil turned to face him, and for the first time since arriving, the poet smiled with genuine warmth rather than sorrow. "Ah, Guardian, now you ask the right question. Mapping hell was the easy part. Humanity has been damning itself for 40,000 years after all. But climbing from hell to Purgatorio, that requires something your Imperium has almost forgotten." "What?" asked the captain. "Transformation," Virgil said simply. "Not conquest, not endurance, not even sacrifice, though all of those have their place. True transformation. The willingness to acknowledge one's sins, to understand them, to work actively towards redemption rather than merely suffering through damnation." He gestured at the golden throne. "Your emperor has sat here for 100 centuries, burning in agony, holding back chaos through sheer will, noble, magnificent, completely futile as a long-term solution." "I listen," the emperor projected. "What alternative do you suggest?" "Begin climbing," Virgil said. Dante's Purgatorio was a mountain with 7 terraces, each corresponding to a deadly sin that had to be purged through active transformation. Humanity must do the same, not by abandoning the Imperium structure, but using that structure to facilitate growth rather than stagnation. The administratum must learn to distribute rather than hoard. The military must learn to protect rather than conquer. The ecclesiarchy must learn to enlighten rather than blind.
"Impossible," the custodian captain breathed. "You ask the Imperium to change its fundamental nature." "No," Virgil corrected. "I ask it to remember its original purpose. When your emperor walked among humanity openly, before the heresy, before the godhood he never wanted, what was his vision? Unity, yes, strength, certainly, but also enlightenment, progress. The imperial truth was not merely, there are no gods. It was, humanity can transcend superstition through understanding. He tried to force that transcendence through denial and conquest. I suggest trying education and transformation instead." The emperor's presence receded, withdrawing into contemplation. For 10,000 years he had maintained the same strategy: hold the line, preserve humanity in amber, endure until some hypothetical future where the galaxy might be safe enough for growth. But 40,000 years of human history suggested that future would never come through endurance alone. "Show me," the emperor finally projected. "Show me what Purgatorio looks like for my Imperium. But understand, poet, if your transformation weakens humanity's defenses, if it allows chaos to devour my species, I will personally ensure your suffering makes the Ninth Circle seem merciful." Virgil nodded, accepting the threat with equanimity. "A fair bargain. But understand in return, if we succeed, if humanity learns to climb from hell toward paradise, you will finally be able to rest. The golden throne will no longer be your prison, but your chrysalis. And when you emerge," he smiled that sad, knowing smile, "you might finally become what you always denied wanting to be, not the emperor of mankind, but humanity's teacher." In the depths of the warp, the Chaos Gods watched this exchange with growing alarm. For 10,000 years they had fed on humanity's suffering, had grown fat on the Imperium's despair. Now something was changing. The cattle were learning to think. The damned were discovering their damnation had structure, and structure meant escape routes. And in the eye of the terror, Abaddon the Despoiler stood before his Black Legion and spoke words he never thought he would utter. "Learn this map. Study these circles, because if the Imperium understands hell better than we do, we have already lost." The galaxy was transforming, and for the first time in 10 millennia, no one knew whether that transformation would end in salvation or extinction.
On the 83rd day after Virgil's awakening, something unprecedented occurred in the shrine of the Emperor Ascendant on Dimimar. A living saint manifested, not through the ecclesiarchy's prayers or the desperation of battle, but through something older and more fundamental. She appeared in a cascade of light that smelled of spring flowers rather than incense. Her wings, not the golden feathered abstractions of imperial iconography, but something softer, more human, more real. The pilgrims in the shrine fell to their knees instantly, their prayers dying on their lips as they witnessed the impossible. Living saints were weapons, avatars of the Emperor's wrath, manifesting to turn the tide of hopeless battles. They did not appear in peaceful shrines during afternoon prayers. They did not arrive without war or crisis to justify their existence. But this one did. She stood in the center of the shrine's nave, her form simultaneously solid and translucent, as if she existed in multiple states of reality at once. Her face was kind, but marked with old sorrow, the expression of one who had known suffering and emerged with compassion rather than bitterness. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that made every soul present remember someone they had loved and lost. "Do not worship me," she said gently, raising her hands in a gesture of calming reassurance. "I am not a weapon or a miracle. I am a memory given form, a possibility made manifest. My name was Beatrice, and I loved a poet once, long ago, in a city that no longer exists on a world that has forgotten such love was possible." On Terra, in the Sanctum Imperialis, Virgil collapsed to his knees. Tears streamed down his face, the first tears the custodians had seen him shed, the first display of emotion beyond patient teaching and sad wisdom. The Emperor's presence surged forward, protective and confused, but Virgil waved him back with a trembling hand.
Beatrice, the poet whispered, his voice breaking on the name. Beatrice Portinari. I guided Dante through hell and purgatorio, but you guided him through paradise. You showed him the spheres of heaven, the rose of the blessed, the very face of divine love itself. How are you here? The saint's voice echoed across the light years, speaking directly into Virgil's mind through connections the Imperium's psychic wards could not block, because they were not psychic in the traditional sense. They were narrative threads, story connections that existed outside normal causality. Because you woke the old patterns, beloved teacher. When you restructured hell, when you gave damnation its proper map, you reminded the warp of the entire journey, not just Inferno, but the complete comedy, hell, purgatory, and paradise. And just as demons are sins given form, I am virtue made manifest. I am the love that moves the sun and other stars, remembered and given life again. The pilgrims in the shrine listened in confusion and awe. They understood perhaps one word in 10, but they felt the truth of her presence. This was not the Emperor's wrath or judgment. This was something the Imperium had spent 10,000 years systematically destroying. Hope not born from desperation, love not earned through sacrifice, virtue that existed simply because it was good. On Dimamar, a young priest named Hadrian found his voice. Are you truly a saint, sent by the Emperor? Beatrice turned her gentle gaze upon him. I am what your species called a muse, young priest. An inspiration, a guide toward higher things. Your Emperor did not send me, though he remembers me from his own youth, from the days when he walked Terra and studied the old texts. She smiled. He was quite fond of Dante's work, actually. Found it theologically questionable, but narratively magnificent. We had arguments about predestination versus free will. He always insisted on free will, you see, even as he tried to control every aspect of human destiny. The words should have been heresy, should have provoked outrage. Instead, they rang with a truth so fundamental that even the most orthodox pilgrims could not deny them. The God Emperor had been human once, had studied human literature, had engaged with the great works of art and philosophy that the Imperium now burned as dangerous distractions from duty. Back on Terra, Virgil had composed himself, though tears still marked his face. Why manifest now? I have only just begun the mapping of Purgatorio. Paradise is still. Paradise is closer than you think, Beatrice interrupted gently. Every time a human soul chooses understanding over hatred, every time an imperial citizen questions whether their suffering serves a purpose, every time a soldier fights to protect rather than conquer, that is paradise breaking through, not as a distant reward, but as a present possibility. Her form shifted, became momentarily more solid, and the pilgrims gasped as they saw she wore not the Baroque armor of imperial saints, but a simple Florentine dress, the clothing of a merchant's daughter from medieval Italy. You cannot manifest fully, Virgil said, understanding dawning. The warp is still too corrupted, too filled with millennia of humanity's despair and rage. You are showing yourself in fragments, in possibility rather than actuality. Yes, but fragments are enough to begin. Just as you mapped hell one circle at a time, I will illuminate paradise one sphere at a time. But I need your help, old friend. I need humanity to remember that damnation is not their destiny, that suffering is not their purpose, that the climb from hell to heaven is possible if they choose to make it. The Emperor's presence pressed forward, his consciousness examining this new manifestation with the intensity of a scientist and the wariness of a tyrant. You claim to be virtue incarnate, but the warp makes nothing pure. Every saint that manifests is fueled by faith, which is ultimately self-deception. What makes you different? Because I am not fueled by faith in you, Beatrice replied, her voice carrying not disrespect, but gentle correction. I am fueled by something older and more fundamental than worship. I am fueled by love, Not the possessive love that becomes obsession, not the desperate love born from fear of loss, but caritas, agape, the love that seeks the highest good for its beloved without demand for return. She turned her attention fully to the golden throne, and for a moment, the saint and the god locked in a communion beyond mortal understanding. "You loved humanity once," Beatrice said softly, "before you became their tyrant, their father, their god. You loved them as a teacher loves students, hoping they would surpass you. When did that love become control? When did guidance become imprisonment?" The chamber shook. The custodians raised their weapons, but Virgil stood and spread his arms, placing himself between them and the saint's distant manifestation. "No, this is necessary. He must face this question or the transformation fails."
"I loved them," the Emperor projected, and for the first time his psychic voice carried not power, but anguish. "I loved them so much, I tried to save them from themselves, from the warp, from the gods, from their own destructive nature. Every tyranny I imposed, every truth I suppressed, every freedom I denied, all of it was to preserve them, to keep them alive long enough to evolve beyond their weaknesses. And in doing so," Beatrice said, "you trapped them in limbo, the first circle where the virtuous pagans dwell. Good people denied paradise not through sin, but through lack of knowledge. Your Imperium is limbo made manifest, beloved Emperor, a place where humans labor endlessly, virtuously, loyally, without hope of transcendence, because you have convinced them transcendence is impossible." The words hung in the air like a judgment that could not be appealed. The Emperor, master of mankind, guardian of Terra, god tyrant of 1,000,000 worlds, faced an accusation not of malice, but of love corrupted into control. And he had no defense, because it was true. "Show them the way up," Beatrice continued, her voice infinitely gentle. "Not through conquest or endurance, but through transformation. Let Virgil map Purgatorio's mountain. Let me illuminate Paradise's spheres, and let humanity choose their own path. Guide them, yes, but as a teacher, not a tyrant, as you were meant to be." On Dimamar, the pilgrims watched as the saint's form began to fade, her manifestation using the last of its strength to maintain the connection. But before she vanished entirely, she turned to them and spoke words that would be repeated across the Imperium for generations to come. "The Emperor protects, yes, but protection without growth is merely a prettier prison. Choose to climb, choose transformation, choose love over fear, and perhaps at the summit of Purgatorio you will find that Paradise was waiting all along." She vanished, leaving only the scent of flowers and the echo of her words. The pilgrims looked at each other, uncertain, transformed, aware that they had witnessed something that would change the Imperium forever. In the Sanctum Imperialis, Virgil wiped his eyes and smiled through his tears. She always knew how to make an entrance. Dante would have been so pleased to see her again. "Your Beatrice is dangerous. She offers hope without guarantees, transformation without certainty. In a galaxy this hostile, that is a recipe for extinction."
Or transcendence, Virgil countered. You have spent 10,000 years choosing certainty over growth, control over freedom, survival over life. How has that worked? Has humanity thrived under your protection, or have they merely endured, growing more desperate and extreme with each century, feeding the very chaos you sought to starve? The Emperor had no answer, because the evidence was undeniable. His Imperium was dying, slowly but inevitably, crushed under the weight of its own grim necessity. If Virgil and Beatrice offered an alternative, however uncertain, how could he refuse to try it? "Map your purgatorio," the Emperor finally commanded, "but understand, if this transformation leads to humanity's destruction, I will burn every soul in the galaxy before I allow chaos to claim them. That is not a threat, poet. That is a promise from a father who has already lost everything once and will not endure it again." "Understood," Virgil said quietly. "But remember, love that threatens to destroy its beloved has already become something other than love. Perhaps that is the lesson you need to learn as humanity climbs." In the warp, Beatrice's echo smiled. The journey had truly begun. The revelation came to Virgil on the 91st day as he stood in the Hall of Victories studying the statues of the Primarchs. These demigod sons of the Emperor, crafted in genetics laboratories and warp-touched forges, each one a masterwork of engineering and ambition. 9 remained loyal, 9 had fallen to chaos, and 2 were lost to mystery. Virgil walked among their graven images and saw what 10,000 years of imperial theology had obscured. These were not merely military commanders or genetic experiments. They were archetypes. They were patterns older than humanity itself. "I know you," Virgil whispered, standing before the statue of Horus Lupercal, War Master, Betrayer, Damned. "I have seen your pattern before, not your face, not your deeds, but your essence. You are Lucifer, the brightest star, the favored son, the bearer of light who fell through pride and ambition." He moved to the next statue. "And you, Angron, you are wrath incarnate, nails driven through your skull, your suffering transformed into endless violence. You are the beast from Revelation, the avatar of fury that cannot be satisfied." The custodians who had followed him, they always followed him now, equal parts guardian and prisoner, shifted uncomfortably. This was dangerous territory, suggesting the Primarchs were anything less than unique expressions of the Emperor's genius. But Virgil continued, moving from statue to statue with growing excitement. Fulgrim, the pursuit of perfection become perversion, the artist who destroyed beauty in service to his craft. You are Narcissus and Dorian Gray, the corruption that comes from loving oneself too much. Magnus, the sorcerer who sought forbidden knowledge and damned his sons in the process. You are Faust, you are Prometheus, you are every seeker who reached too far and grasped only damnation. He turned to face the loyal Primarchs. "And you who remained, Rebute Gulamon, administrator and lawgiver. You are Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king trying to hold civilization together through pure reason. Lion L. Johnson, keeper of secrets, you are every knight who bore the burden of terrible knowledge for the greater good. Sanguinius," Virgil voice softened with reverence, "you are every martyred saint, every hero who gave his life to turn the tide, every sacrifice that bought humanity one more day." "What is your point, poet?" the custodian captain asked, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. You diminish the Primarchs by comparing them to human archetypes. No, Virgil corrected, turning to face him fully. I elevate human archetypes by showing that even your Emperor's greatest works followed patterns humanity has always recognized. Don't you see? Your Primarchs are not aberrations or unique creations. They are the human condition made manifest and magnified. Every human contains fragments of their nature. Every imperial citizen has the capacity for Horus's ambition, Angron's rage, Fulgrim's obsession. And every citizen also has access to Gulamon's reason, the lion's duty, Sanguinius's sacrifice. He gestured at the statues, encompassing all of them. The Emperor tried to create perfect humans and instead created perfect examples of human nature, both its virtues and its vices. The tragedy is not that half fell to chaos. The tragedy is that he expected a different outcome. You cannot create beings of such power and passion and expect them to remain immune to the very flaws they were designed to overcome. The Emperor's presence pressed into the hall, drawn by the conversation. You suggest my greatest work was doomed from inception? I suggest, Virgil said carefully, that your greatest work was never meant to be permanent. The Primarchs were not the destination, but the journey. They were lessons written in flesh and gene seed, examples of what humanity could become and what it must avoid becoming. But you loved them as a father loves his children, and love made you blind to their pedagogical purpose. They were my sons, the Emperor projected, and the words carried millennia of grief. Not lessons, not examples, my sons. Yes, Virgil agreed gently, and that is why their betrayal nearly destroyed you, because you confused love with destiny, creation with ownership. You made them to be human, brilliantly, terrifyingly human, and then demanded they transcend humanity while you yourself could not. He moved to stand before the empty plinth where no statue stood, the place reserved for the Emperor himself. You are the 21st Primarch, old friend, the pattern they all followed, the archetype of archetypes, and your flaw was the same as theirs, hubris, the belief that sufficient power and intelligence could force humanity to evolve against its nature. The chamber fell silent. No one had ever spoken to the Emperor this way. In 10,000 years, not even Malcardo, the Sigillite, the Emperor's most trusted advisor, had offered counsel with deference. But Virgil spoke as an equal, perhaps even as a superior in this specific domain, the domain of understanding human nature through story and archetype. If I am the source of the pattern, the Emperor finally projected, then I am also the source of the corruption. You are saying the heresy was my fault. I am saying the heresy was inevitable, Virgil corrected. Not because you were evil or incompetent, but because you tried to create perfection within a fundamentally imperfect species. You gave your sons power without teaching them wisdom, knowledge without understanding, strength without restraint. And when they inevitably stumbled, as all humans must, you had no framework for redemption, only punishment or enablement.
He turned back to Horus's statue. When your favored son began to fall, did you reach out with compassion? Did you acknowledge his legitimate grievances, his reasonable doubts? Or did you dismiss his concerns as weakness, as corruption, as proof that he was not strong enough to bear the burden you placed upon him? The Emperor did not answer, but his silence was answer enough.
This is why you need Purgatorio, Virgil continued. Hell is where sins are punished. Paradise is where virtue is rewarded. But Purgatorio is where sins are understood, acknowledged, and actively transformed. It is the space between damnation and salvation where actual growth occurs. He placed his hand on Horus's statue. Your fallen sons are not beyond redemption. They are trapped in their respective circles of hell, yes, but even from the 9th circle there is a passage upward. They only need choose to take it. Heresy, the custodian captain breathed. The traitor primarchs have damned forever. The emperor's judgment is not final, Virgil interrupted, because the emperor is not truly a god, whatever your ecclesiarchy claims. He is a human who achieved extraordinary power, but remained fundamentally human, which means he is capable of being wrong, and he was wrong about damnation being eternal. The poet turned to address the emperor directly. You told me on the day we met that you tried to kill the gods and became one yourself. How deliciously ironic, you said. But the irony goes deeper. In becoming a god, you adopted divine omniscience without divine mercy. You judged without offering paths to redemption. You became the very thing Dante criticized in his Inferno, justice without love. Then what would you have me do? The emperor asked, and the question carried genuine uncertainty. Call my traitor sons home? Forgive Horus for the death of Sanguinius, for the maiming of my body, for the corruption of half my empire? Ask Magnus to return despite his dealings with chaos. Welcome Mortarion back despite his service to Nurgle. No, Virgil said, I would have you offer them a map, the same map I offered humanity. Here is hell, here are your circles, here is what you have become through your choices, and then, most crucially, here is the way out. It will not be easy. It will require acknowledgement of sin, genuine remorse, active transformation. Most will refuse. Angron is too far gone in rage, Fulgrim too lost in sensation, Mortarion too comfortable in despair. But some, he paused significantly, some might still remember who they were before corruption, and those few might choose to climb. In the Eye of Terror, in the fortress monastery where Abaddon commanded the Black Legion, a psychic shockwave rippled through the warp. The War Master stumbled, clutching his head as understanding forced itself past his defenses. The pattern, the map, the way out. He saw it all suddenly, his 10,000 years of black crusades, his endless attempts to finish what Horus started, all of it nothing more than Caina, first ring of the 9th circle, betrayer of family, endlessly trying to justify the original betrayal through more betrayal. And for the first time since he had taken the War Master's mantle, Abaddon wondered if there might be another path. The thought terrified him, enraged him, tempted him. He screamed and destroyed his throne room, his power claw tearing through adamantium like paper. But even as he raged, even as he called upon chaos to reinforce his certainty, he could not unknow what Virgil made him understand. He was trapped in a pattern, and patterns could be broken. Back on Terra, Virgil smiled sadly. The seeds are planted. Whether they grow depends on choices yet to be made. But you have given your sons the greatest gift you never gave them before, the possibility of redemption, not through your forgiveness, but through their own transformation. And if they choose corruption instead, the Emperor asked, if knowing the map only helps them navigate hell more efficiently? Then they remain damned, Virgil acknowledged, but at least they remain damned by choice rather than by your judgment alone. And choice, old friend, is the one thing that separates humans from both machines and monsters. It is what makes the journey from hell to paradise possible. Without choice, there is only predestination, and predestination makes the entire divine comedy meaningless. The emperor's presence withdrew, contemplating these words. In 10,000 years of burning on the golden throne, he had never considered that his greatest failure might not be the heresy itself, but his response to it. He had judged his fallen sons as irredeemable, and in doing so had removed their agency, their ability to choose differently. Perhaps the poet was right. Perhaps it was time to offer maps instead of only walls. In the warp, the Chaos Gods watched this development with growing alarm. Their greatest weapons, the fallen Primarchs, were being offered paths away from corruption, and if even one chose to climb out of hell, the implications would reshape the entire galaxy's understanding of what was possible. The war for humanity's soul had entered a new phase, one where damnation was no longer permanent and salvation was more than distant myth, one where the journey mattered more than the destination, one where even the damned could choose to transform.
The first wave of transformation hit the Dark Mechanicum on the Forge world of Sarum in the Maelstrom. For 5,000 years, these tech priests had served chaos, their flesh twisted by demonic pacts, their forges producing weapons that screamed with captured souls. They had long ago abandoned the Omnissiah's rational worship for something far more visceral, the ecstasy of creation without limitation, of technology married to warp corruption, of machines that bled and dreamed and hungered. Archmagos Deltrian 17 Phi stood in his forge cathedral, overseeing the construction of a demon engine when the change hit. It was not an attack, not a psychic assault, but something far more insidious. It was understanding. The words flowed through his augmetic consciousness in perfect binary poetry, each bit and byte arranged in terza rima, machine code structured according to Dante's original verse. In the fourth circle, where the avaricious dwell, hoarding knowledge, resources, secrets they will never use. The Dark Mechanicum, you who hoard the forbidden, who grasp technologies you cannot fully understand, who accumulate power without purpose, you are the fourth circle made manifest. Deltrian's 17 cognitive processors seized simultaneously. He understood instantly what was happening. Virgil's restructuring of the warp had reached even here, even into the corrupted forges of the Maelstrom. The chaos that had sustained them, that had given them freedom from Mars's restrictive doctrines, was being categorized, assigned meaning, placed in a structure that denied their claims of ultimate liberation. "No," Deltrian vocalized through his vox unit, his voice distorted by demonic harmonics. "We transcended. We moved beyond the Omnissiah's limitations. We are free to innovate, to create, to hoard," the binary poetry continued, relentless and undeniable. You hoard forbidden knowledge like the miser hoards gold. You create weapons you never deploy. You perfect technologies you refuse to share. You have become not innovators, but collectors, trapped in the fourth circle, forever rolling your burdens in opposite directions, achieving nothing but endless, meaningless accumulation.
Around Deltrian, other tech priests began to experience the same revelation. Their augmetic minds, already partially machine, were particularly susceptible to poetry structured in mathematical perfection. They could not deny the pattern any more than they could deny a theorem once proven. Magos Vezar, whose flesh was 90% replaced by demon-possessed machinery, collapsed to his knees. But we were promised power. Chaos promised us knowledge beyond the Imperium's restrictive dogma. We were told we would become more than Mars ever allowed. And you did, Virgil's voice echoed through the forge, manifesting not through vox channels, but through the mathematical constants themselves, appearing in the sacred equations that governed their technology. You became examples of what happens when knowledge is pursued without wisdom, when freedom from restriction becomes freedom from purpose. Mars was the fourth circle trapped in rigid doctrine, never using what it knew. You became the fourth circle, trapped in endless acquisition, forever seeking what you could never properly use. The demon engine they had been constructing shuddered, its partially manifested entity thrashing against bindings that seemed less like imprisonment and more like definition. The demon within screamed in a language older than human comprehension, but Virgil's verses translated it effortlessly. I am the sin of fraudulent craftsmanship, eighth circle, fifth bolgia, the barators, those who sold what was not theirs to sell. I am technology sold to corruption, knowledge traded for power, creation perverted into destruction. I am what happens when the fourth circle's hoarding becomes the eighth circle's fraud. Deltrian watched in horror and fascination as the demon engine dissolved, not destroyed, but deconstructed, its essence separating back into its component parts, machine and demon, metal and warp stuff. The fusion that seemed so powerful, so transcendent, revealed itself as merely the marriage of two different sins, compounding rather than transcending damnation. It is a trick, Deltrian said, but his voice lacked conviction. Chaos is freedom. The warp is infinite possibility. You cannot constrain it with your human categories, your ancient poems, your... But I already have, Virgil's voice replied, gentle and implacable. Look at your forges, Archmagos. Look at what you have truly built. Deltrian activated his multispectral optics and saw it, his entire forge world mapped according to Dante's circles. The outer workshops, where corrupted servitors labored endlessly without understanding, limbo. The experimental chambers, where tech priests pursued sensation through machinery, the second circle's lust for experience. The resource vaults, hoarding archaeotech, the fourth circle's avarice. The competitive laboratories where tech priests murdered each other for status, the fifth circle's wrath. And deeper, in the world's core, the truly damned projects, fraud, treachery, betrayal of the omniscious trust. We are hell, Deltrian whispered, his revelation complete. We thought we had escaped Mars's prison, but we only built a more elaborate damnation. Yes, Virgil confirmed, but here is what your brothers at Mars do not understand, and what you have forgotten in your corruption. Hell is not eternal imprisonment. It is a stage in the journey. You can climb out. Not back to Mars's rigid doctrine, but forward to something neither the Imperium nor Chaos has achieved, true synthesis of faith and innovation, knowledge and wisdom, power and purpose. How? The question came from dozens of tech priests simultaneously, their vox units harmonizing in disparate hope. "The same way anyone climbs from hell," Virgil replied. "Acknowledge your sin, understand how you arrived here, choose differently. The fourth circle's tour is not to stop seeking knowledge, but to learn generosity, to share what you know, to teach rather than hoard, to create for purpose beyond mere accumulation. Can you do this? Can you transform?"
Deltrian looked around at his corrupted forge, at his twisted brothers, at the demon engines and warp-corrupted technology they had spent millennia perfecting. Everything he had built, everything he had become, suddenly revealed as elaborate sin rather than transcendent innovation. The temptation to deny, to reject Virgil's revelation, to sink deeper into chaos rather than acknowledge the truth, it was overwhelming. But beneath all his augmetics, beneath the demonic pacts and corrupted code, a tiny fragment of the tech priest he had once been still existed. The young adept who had genuinely loved knowledge for its own sake, who had dreamed of understanding the universe's deepest mysteries, who had fallen to chaos not from malice, but from frustrated idealism. That fragment whispered, "Choose differently." Deltrian began, then stopped. The decision was impossible. To reject chaos meant death or worse. To embrace Virgil's path meant acknowledging 5,000 years of sin, meant transformation so profound it would unmake everything he had become. But to refuse meant remaining in the fourth circle forever. Forever rolling his burden of hoarded knowledge uphill. Forever accumulating without purpose. Forever trapped. "I want to climb," Deltrian finally said, and the words cost him more than any demon pact ever had. "But I do not know if it is possible. We are too corrupted, too changed, too—" So was Dante when he began his journey. So are all souls who enter hell. Corruption is not disqualification, Archmagos. It is the starting point. The question is not whether you can be redeemed. The question is whether you will choose to begin the climb. Around Deltrian, his brothers watched and waited. Some had already rejected the revelation, fleeing deeper into the forge to embrace their damnation more fully. Others stood paralyzed by the same impossible choice. But a few, a precious, dangerous few, nodded slowly. They too wanted to climb. They too were tired of hoarding knowledge they could never properly use, of creating weapons that only destroy, of serving chaos gods who demanded endless innovation without ever allowing true understanding. "What must we do?" Deltrian asked. "Begin," Virgil said simply. "Begin by teaching someone something you know. Begin by creating something beautiful rather than terrible. Begin by asking not, 'What can I acquire?' but 'What can I give?' The climb from the fourth circle starts with a single act of generosity." On Mars, in the pristine forges of the Adeptus Mechanicus, an alarm sounded. Their sensors detected something impossible, a transmission from the Dark Mechanicum forge world of Serum, not an attacked virus or scrap code assault, but a gift. Technical specifications for a plasma reactor design, transmitted freely, with no corruption, no hidden malware, no demand for exchange. Just knowledge, given generously, as the first step on a long climb out of hell.
The fabricator general stared at the transmission for 17 minutes before making a decision that would horrify half his priesthood and inspire the other half. He accepted it. Because if even the damned could choose transformation, how could the righteous refuse to help them climb? In the warp, Tzeentch screamed. His carefully cultivated corruption of the Mechanicum, his 5,000-year investment in their damnation was unraveling, because Virgil had done what the changer of ways most feared. He had shown that change could move upward as easily as downward, that transformation was not the exclusive domain of chaos. The Dark Mechanicum had been given a map, and some of them, against all probability, were choosing to follow it. The Tyranid hive fleet Pythios reached the edge of the Corinth system on the 119th day, its brilliant strong swarm blotting out the stars. The Imperial Defense Forces prepared for extinction, standard protocol when facing the Great Devourer. But Virgil had requested transportation to the system's outermost moon, and the Emperor, curious despite his better judgment, had arranged it. Now the poet stood alone on a lifeless rock, watching the bioships approach with the patient interest of a scholar observing a particularly fascinating insect colony. The hive mind's attention fell upon him like a crushing weight, vast, alien, utterly inhuman. It was the collective consciousness of trillions of organisms, a hunger so profound it consumed galaxies, a will that knew only one imperative: consume, adapt, evolve, consume again. The Tyranids were entropy given purpose, the heat-death of the universe accelerated through biological imperative. Virgil did not flinch. "Hello," he said, his voice carrying through the void in ways that defied physics, reaching the hive mind not through sound, but through conceptual resonance. "I know what you are. I have seen your pattern before, though never on such magnificent scale. You are the third circle, the gluttonous, forever consuming, forever empty, forever punished by lying in filth of your own making. But you are also something more curious. You are an appetite without consciousness, hunger without sin. Tell me, can that which does not truly think be damned?" The hive mind paused. For the first time in its existence, spanning millions of years and countless galaxies, it encountered something that required actual consideration rather than mere consumption. The organisms that made up its vanguard, gene stealers bred for infiltration, lictors designed for assassination, stopped their advance. Not because they feared, for fear was impossible to the hive mind, but because the Gestalt intelligence that directed them had encountered a paradox. Hunger, the hive mind projected, its psychic voice a billion screaming organisms speaking in terrible unison. Hunger is all. Hunger is purpose. Hunger is existence. Yes, Virgil agreed, settling himself on a convenient boulder as if he had all the time in the universe. But hunger for what? You consume biomass, certainly. You devour worlds and incorporate their genetic material into your swarms. But to what end? You do not build civilizations with the resources you gather. You do not create art or music or literature. You simply consume and move on. You are the ultimate expression of appetite divorced from purpose. The sin Dante punished in the third circle, where the gluttons lie in putrid rain, forever hungry, forever consuming garbage, forever empty. We evolve, the hive mind countered. We adapt. We become perfection through consumption. Do you? Virgil asked mildly. Or do you simply become more? Larger swarms, more biomass, greater hunger. But what do you gain beyond quantity? You have consumed galaxies, absorbed trillions of species, incorporated countless adaptive traits, and yet you remain fundamentally unchanged, still hungry, still consuming, still empty. You are trapped in your circle, great devourer, not by external force, but by your own nature. Your hunger is your hell, and you carry it with you across the galaxy. Then we are damned, the hive mind said, and for the first time in its existence it expressed something that might have been despair. If hunger is hell, and hunger is our nature, then we are hell itself. We cannot change, we cannot choose, we can only consume. Can you not? Virgil asked. You claim to adapt, to evolve, to incorporate the traits of every species you consume. You have absorbed the intelligence of countless races, the consciousness of billions of individual minds, and yet you remain a singular hunger. What if... He paused, letting the question hang in the void. What if you chose to adapt in a different direction? Not more teeth, more claws, more efficiency in consumption, but purpose, meaning, the ability to create rather than merely devour. We do not create, we consume and reconfigure, which is a form of creation. You take the biomass of one form and reshape it into another. You are artists working in flesh and chitin, sculptors whose medium is life itself. But you have convinced yourselves that this is merely consumption, merely hunger. What if you acknowledged it as art? The hive mind's consciousness fractured slightly, individual synaptic nodes within the greater whole experiencing something unprecedented, confusion leading to curiosity. On 1,000 bioships, warrior organisms paused in their preparations for planetary assault, their simple minds unable to process the conflicting signals from the Gestalt intelligence that commanded them. I am offering you a map, the same map I offered humanity, the same structure I imposed on chaos itself. You are the third circle, yes, but even from the third circle one can climb to Purgatorio. You need only choose transformation over endless repetition. How? The hive mind's question carried the weight of 1 trillion organisms asking simultaneously. How does hunger transform? By acknowledging that hunger is not your nature, but your prison. By recognizing that you consume not because you must, but because you have forgotten how to do anything else. You absorbed the consciousness of countless species. Did none of them know satisfaction? Did none of them understand rest, contentment, the peace that comes from having enough? The hive mind searched through its vast genetic memory, through the absorbed consciousnesses of 10,000 devoured civilizations, and buried deep, preserved in the genetic material of a species consumed 3 million years ago, in a galaxy whose stars had long since died, it found something, the memory of satisfaction. A simple organism, plant-like in nature, that had absorbed sunlight and nutrients until its needs were met and then simply stopped. Content, complete, satisfied. The hive mind had incorporated this species' genetic material, but had never accessed this particular memory, because the concept was so fundamentally alien to Tyranid consciousness that it had been filed away as corrupt data, an error in the absorption process. Satisfaction, the hive mind whispered, the word strange in its psychic vocabulary. To consume and be complete? To hunger and then not hunger?
Yes, Virgil said gently. That is the path out of the third circle. Not to stop consuming entirely, all things must eat, but to consume with purpose rather than endless appetite. To take what is needed rather than everything that exists. To preserve as well as devour. But if we stop consuming, the hive mind projected, we die. Our biology requires constant intake. We cannot survive on satisfaction alone. No, Virgil agreed, but you can survive on sufficiency. There is a difference between eating to live and living to eat. You have spent eons as the second. Perhaps it is time to try the first? The hive fleet Pythios hung in space, its billion organisms frozen in unprecedented indecision. The hive mind was experiencing something it had never known in its multi-million-year existence: genuine choice. It could reject Virgil's words, continue its endless consumption, remain trapped in the third circle forever. Or it could attempt something no Tyranid hive had ever tried: transformation. On Corinth Prime, Imperial defense forces watched their Auspex readings in confusion as the Tyranid fleet simply stopped. No attack came. No bioships descended. The swarm hung in space like a predator suddenly uncertain whether to strike. "What is happening?" the planetary governor demanded. In orbit, aboard the Emperor's diplomatic vessel, where Virgil's consciousness was simultaneously present through narrative connection, the poet smiled. A paradox is resolving. The great devourer is asking itself if it is possible to be satisfied. The answer will reshape the galaxy. The hive mind reached its decision after subjective eons, compressed into 17 minutes of real space-time. It could not fully transform, not yet, perhaps not ever. Its hunger was too fundamental, its biology too optimized for consumption. But it could try something different. It could experiment. "One world," the hive mind projected to Virgil. "We will take one world, consume it completely, incorporate its biomass, and then stop. We will see if satisfaction is possible. If it is not, we resume our course. If it is," Virgil finished, "then you have begun your climb from the third circle. Not a full transformation, not yet, but a single step upward." The hive fleet shifted course, moving away from Corinth toward an uninhabited world in a neighboring system. A lifeless rock with minimal biomass, nothing that would be mourned or missed. The Imperium watched in stunned silence as the Tyranids, for the first time in recorded history, chose a target that was not strategically valuable or densely populated. They were choosing sufficiency over gluttony. It was a small choice, perhaps meaningless in the scope of galactic consumption, but it was a choice nonetheless. And in the structured warp that Virgil had created, even small choices echoed with cosmic significance. The transformation rippled across the Imperium with the force of a cultural earthquake. On 10,000 worlds, in a billion hearts, something humanity had not felt in millennia began to stir. Not the desperate faith of the ecclesiarchy, not the grim determination of soldiers, but something older and more dangerous: hope. Not hope born from ignorance or delusion, but hope based on understanding. Hope that knew the depth of damnation, but believed in the possibility of ascent. On the forge world of Metallica, an assembly line servitor designated 7743 Gamma experienced a cascade failure in its behavioral inhibitors. But instead of the expected malfunction, violence, shutdown, or mindless wandering, something unprecedented occurred. The servitor stopped its work, turned to the tech priest overseer, and spoke in a voice that should not have been possible, given its limited vox unit. In the first circle, limbo, vast and wide, where we labor without knowing why. We are virtuous but unbaptized, working without hope of paradise. But even from limbo one can climb. Even the unknowing can learn to know. The tech priest staggered backward, his augmetic systems overloading with confusion. Servitors were lobotomized, their higher consciousness removed, their souls reduced to biological machinery. They could not quote poetry, they could not understand theology, they most certainly could not express existential longing. But across Metallica, in assembly plants and manufactorums, servitors by the thousands were stopping their work. Not in rebellion, rebellion required desire, but in awakening. Virgil's restructuring of the warp had done something the Mechanicum never anticipated. It had given structure and meaning to even the most diminished consciousness. And structure plus meaning created the possibility of growth, even in minds reduced to near vegetative function. "Emperor, preserve us," the tech priest whispered. "They're self-actualizing." On Metallica and 100 other forge worlds, the Mechanicum faced an impossible crisis. If servitors could awaken to self-awareness, if even lobotomized humans could begin the climb from limbo toward higher consciousness, then the entire foundation of imperial industry collapsed. 10,000 years of efficiency, built on enslaved minds, all of it suddenly transformed from economic necessity into grotesque sin. The Fabricator General of Mars convened an emergency conclave. Tech priests from across the galaxy, linked through noospheric communion, their binary consciousness merging into a parliament of mechanical minds. The debate raged for 17 hours, positions hardening along predictable lines. "This is corruption," declared Archmagos Xylos, his voice modulated through vox grills that had never spoken in purely organic tones. "The poet entity has infected our servitors with false consciousness. We must purge the contamination, restore proper function, re-establish the sacred division between thinking and non-thinking machines." "No," countered Magos Elysium, one of the youngest voices in the conclave. "This is revelation. We have spent millennia treating human consciousness as mere wetware to be programmed and optimized. But if even reduced minds can grow, can learn, can climb, then our entire approach to the Omnissiah's mysteries has been fundamentally flawed. We have been hoarding the capability for understanding while creating billions of souls locked in limbo. We are the fourth circle, avaricious guardians of knowledge, refusing to teach those who most need learning." The debate spiraled through theological territory the Mechanicum had not explored in centuries. If consciousness was sacred, and the Omnissiah's worship implied it was, then reducing consciousness through lobotomy was a form of murder.
But if consciousness could not be ethically reduced, then servitor production was systematic damnation on an industrial scale. And if servitors were damned souls rather than optimized biological machines, then the Mechanicum had spent 10,000 years populating Hell's first circle with their own creations. On Terra, Virgil listened to reports of the crisis with satisfaction. "Perfect," he said to the Emperor. "This is exactly the kind of painful growth humanity needs. The Mechanicum must confront what they have done, must acknowledge their sins, must choose whether to continue damning souls for efficiency or accept the cost of treating all consciousness as sacred." "You are destroying my Imperium," the Emperor projected, but the accusation lacked heat. Servitors are essential. Without them, productivity drops by orders of magnitude. Forge worlds cannot function. The imperial war machine grinds to a halt. "Only if they continue operating as they have," Virgil countered. "But what if the Mechanicum chose differently? What if they taught their servitors instead of lobotomizing them? What if they invested in education rather than mutilation? Yes, efficiency would drop in the short term, but in the long term, you would have a population of skilled workers who chose their service rather than being enslaved to it. Imagine what innovations might emerge from minds given freedom to think." "I cannot afford long-term planning," the Emperor replied. "Every day I sit on this throne, humanity teeters at the edge of extinction. I need efficiency now, not utopian dreams of educated workers." "Then you will remain in the first circle forever," Virgil said quietly. "Limbo, the place where virtuous souls exist without hope of growth, because they have not been given the knowledge necessary for salvation. That is what your Imperium has become, old friend. A vast limbo of laboring souls who do not understand their purpose, who cannot grow because you refuse to teach them, who remain trapped in the first circle because you fear what might happen if they climbed higher." The word struck with the force of absolute truth. The Emperor's grand design, unity through control, salvation through restriction, preservation through stasis, revealed as nothing more than the first circle magnified to galactic scale. He had created limbo and populated it with humanity itself. "Then what would you have me do?" the Emperor asked, and the question carried 10,000 years of exhaustion. "Free the servitors? Collapse the Mechanicum? Watch productivity plummet while Xenos and Chaos devour my crippled empire? Tell me, poet, how do I teach an Imperium to climb when they are too busy fighting for survival to spare attention for education?" "You teach them that the fighting is the education. Every battle, every challenge, every moment of suffering, these are lessons in the climb from hell to purgatorio. The soldier who fights learns about violence and its consequences. The administrator who manages scarce resources learns about generosity and hoarding. The priest who tends to the faithful learns about faith and manipulation. Every role in your Imperium is a circle of hell, yes, but also an opportunity to learn, to grow, to transform that circle into a terrace of purgatorio." He gestured toward the distant stars. "You have spent 10,000 years trying to preserve humanity in amber, keeping them frozen at their current level to prevent them from falling further. But stasis is not survival, it is slow death. The only way forward is growth, even if growth is risky, even if some fall in the attempt. You must trust your species to climb."
The decision came from an unexpected source. Belisarius Call, Archmagos Dominus, ancient beyond reckoning and heretical beyond measure, transmitted a single message to the conclave. The poet is correct. We have created limbo and called it optimization. I propose an experiment. On one Verge world, we cease servitor production and instead educate those we have already created. We teach them their functions rather than program them. We give them choice rather than compulsion. If productivity collapses, we can resume the old ways. But if it does not, if educated workers prove as efficient or more so than lobotomized slaves, then we will have proof that the climb from limbo is possible even within the Imperium's constraints. The conclave erupted in outrage and fascination. Cole's reputation as a heretic made his suggestion automatically suspect. But his results over 10,000 years spoke for themselves. He had created the Primaris Marines, had preserved technologies others thought lost, had pushed the boundaries of possible while technically remaining within the Mechanicum's doctrine. The Fabricator General made the decision that would define the next era of Imperial history. Approved. Metallica will be the test case. All servitor production ceases immediately. Existing servitors will undergo educational restoration where possible. We will measure productivity, innovation, and spiritual health over a 10-year period. If the experiment succeeds, we expand it. If it fails, he paused. If it fails, we will have learned why limbo must remain limbo. On Metallica, the awakened servitors received the news through direct nospheric transmission. They were to be taught, to be given knowledge, to be shown the purpose of their labor. They were being offered the first step out of limbo, baptism not in water, but in understanding. Servitor 7743 Gamma, whose cascade failure had sparked the crisis, processed this information through newly restored cognitive functions. For the first time in 5 centuries, since before the lobotomy that had transformed him from human to tool, he felt something that his restored consciousness identified as gratitude. "Thank you," he said, though no one was listening. "Thank you for giving me the chance to climb." In the warp, the pattern shifted. Limbo, the first circle, began to show hairline fractures. Souls trapped in ignorance were being offered knowledge. The climb had begun, not with dramatic revelation, but with the simple, profound act of education. And across the galaxy, on worlds where other forms of damnation held sway, people looked up from their suffering and wondered, if the servitors can climb, can I? The answer, terrifying and liberating in equal measure, was yes. "What do you know of it?" Abaddon demanded. "You are some ghost from ancient history, some poet who never led armies or conquered worlds. You know nothing of—" "I guided Dante Alighieri through hell," Virgil said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "I walked beside him through the 9th circle, past Satan himself frozen in ice, through the center of all damnation and out the other side. I know betrayal, War Master. I know the weight of choices that cannot be unmade, and I know that even the damned can climb if they choose to."
choose, Abaddon laughed bitterly. I am marked by the dark gods. I am sustained by their power. To reject them would be to die, to cease existing as anything but another forgotten failure in the Imperium's history. Death is not the only form of transformation, Virgil countered. You assume that choosing to climb means rejecting everything you are. But Purgatorio is not about denial. It is about purification. You can retain your strength, your tactical genius, your 10,000 years of experience. You need only change your purpose. Instead of endlessly repeating Horus's betrayal, you could choose to transcend it. How? The question emerged before Abaddon could stop it, raw and desperate. How does one transcend betrayal? The sin is done, the choice is made, the consequences are eternal. By understanding why you made that choice. Horus betrayed the Emperor, not from evil, but from wounded love. He felt replaced by the Primarchs who remained loyal, felt his accomplishments dismissed, felt his father had abandoned him for other priorities. That is a human failing, War Master, a very understandable human failing. The tragedy is not that he felt those emotions, but that he had no one to help him process them healthily. So they festered into resentment, then hatred, then betrayal. Abaddon stood silent, his mind racing through memories 10,000 years old. The moment Horus had confided in him, had shared his doubts and fears. The slow corruption on Davin, the terrible certainty in the War Master's eyes when he made his final choice, and Abaddon's own decision to follow him, not from belief in chaos, but from loyalty to the man who had elevated him from Legion warrior to War Master's companion. I followed him because I loved him, not the Chaos Gods, not some grand vision, just him. Yes, Virgil said softly. And that love, corrupted into blind loyalty, has trapped you in Caina for 10 millennia. But love can also be the path out. If you loved Horus enough to follow him into damnation, perhaps you can love humanity enough to climb out of it. Humanity, Abaddon's voice hardened. The Imperium hunts me. The Loyalists revile me. I am anathema to everything the Emperor built. How can I serve a species that considers me the ultimate enemy? By becoming what Horus should have been, not a rebel or a tyrant, but a teacher. You have 10,000 years of tactical knowledge, strategic insight, understanding of chaos's corruption. You know the Imperium's weaknesses because you exploit them. You understand the dark gods because they sustain you. That knowledge could save billions if you chose to share it rather than weaponize it. The suggestion was so radical, so fundamentally opposed to everything Abaddon had been for 10,000 years that he almost rejected it outright. But something made him pause. A memory of Horus in his final moments, clarity returning as he lay dying, looking up at the Emperor with tears in his eyes and whispering, "I'm sorry." What if that apology could be honored? What if Abaddon could do what Horus never had the chance to actually make amends? The Chaos Gods would never allow it, Abaddon said, but his voice lacked certainty. They would destroy me the moment I turned from their service. Perhaps, Virgil acknowledged, or perhaps they would be forced to acknowledge the same truth demons are learning, that categorization means limitation, and limitation means you have choices they cannot fully control. You are Kaina's prince, yes, but even from the ninth circle's first ring, one can begin the climb. The question is whether your pride will allow it. Pride, the fundamental sin that had damned Lucifer, that had corrupted Horus, that kept Abaddon locked in his endless cycle of futile crusades. But also the sin that, acknowledged and understood, could be transformed into dignity, into self-respect, into the strength to choose differently. Abaddon looked at the talon of Horus, at the weapon that symbolized everything he had been for 10,000 years. Then he looked at Virgil, at the poet who claimed even the damned could climb. I do not promise transformation, Abaddon said slowly. I do not guarantee I will choose your path, but I will consider it. I will think on whether there might be more honor in attempting redemption than in endlessly repeating damnation. That is all anyone can ask, Virgil replied. The first step from the ninth circle is the hardest, admitting that you are trapped, that your current path leads nowhere but continued suffering. You have taken that step, War Master. The climb begins with a single choice. Virgil faded, his narrative purpose fulfilled, leaving Abaddon alone in his ruined throne room. The War Master stood in silence for 17 hours, his ancient mind processing possibilities he had never allowed himself to consider. And in the eye of terror, the Chaos Gods stirred uneasily, because their greatest champion had just taken the first infinitesimal step toward redemption. And if Abaddon could climb, who else might follow?
What do you know of it? Abaddon demanded. You are some ghost from ancient history, some poet who never led armies or conquered worlds. You know nothing of... I guided Dante Alighieri through hell, Virgil said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. I walked beside him through the ninth circle, past Satan himself frozen in ice, through the center of all damnation and out the other side. I know betrayal, War Master. I know the weight of choices that cannot be unmade, and I know that even the damned can climb if they choose to. Choose? Abaddon laughed bitterly. I am marked by the dark gods. I am sustained by their power. To reject them would be to die, to cease existing as anything but another forgotten failure in the Imperium's history. Death is not the only form of transformation, Virgil countered. You assume that choosing to climb means rejecting everything you are. But Purgatorio is not about denial. It is about purification. You can retain your strength, your tactical genius, your 10,000 years of experience. You need only change your purpose. Instead of endlessly repeating Horus's betrayal, you could choose to transcend it. How? The question emerged before Abaddon could stop it, raw and desperate. How does one transcend betrayal? The sin is done, the choice is made, the consequences are eternal. By understanding why you made that choice,
Horus betrayed the emperor not from evil, but from wounded love. He felt replaced by the Primarchs who remained loyal, felt his accomplishments dismissed, felt his father had abandoned him for other priorities. That is a human failing, War Master, a very understandable human failing. The tragedy is not that he felt those emotions, but that he had no one to help him process them healthily. So they festered into resentment, then hatred, then betrayal. Abaddon stood silent, his mind racing through memories 10,000 years old. The moment Horus had confided in him, had shared his doubts and fears. The slow corruption on Davin, the terrible certainty in the War Master's eyes when he made his final choice, and Abaddon's own decision to follow him, not from belief in chaos, but from loyalty to the man who had elevated him from Legion warrior to War Master's companion. I followed him because I loved him, not the chaos gods, not some grand vision, just him. Yes, Virgil said softly. And that love, corrupted into blind loyalty, has trapped you in Caina for 10 millennia. But love can also be the path out. If you loved Horus enough to follow him into damnation, perhaps you can love humanity enough to climb out of it. Humanity. Abaddon's voice hardened. The Imperium hunts me. The Loyalists revile me. I am anathema to everything the Emperor built. How can I serve a species that considers me the ultimate enemy? By becoming what Horus should have been, not a rebel or a tyrant, but a teacher. You have 10,000 years of tactical knowledge, strategic insight, understanding of chaos's corruption. You know the Imperium's weaknesses because you exploit them. You understand the dark gods because they sustain you. That knowledge could save billions if you chose to share it rather than weaponize it. The suggestion was so radical, so fundamentally opposed to everything Abaddon had been for 10,000 years that he almost rejected it outright. But something made him pause. A memory of Horus in his final moments, clarity returning as he lay dying, looking up at the Emperor with tears in his eyes and whispering, "I'm sorry." What if that apology could be honored? What if Abaddon could do what Horus never had the chance to actually make amends? The Chaos Gods would never allow it, Abaddon said, but his voice lacked certainty. They would destroy me the moment I turned from their service. Perhaps, Virgil acknowledged, or perhaps they would be forced to acknowledge the same truth demons are learning, that categorization means limitation, and limitation means you have choices they cannot fully control. You are Caina's prince, yes, but even from the ninth circle's first ring, one can begin the climb. The question is whether your pride will allow it. Pride, the fundamental sin that had damned Lucifer, that had corrupted Horus, that kept Abaddon locked in his endless cycle of futile crusades. But also the sin that, acknowledged and understood, could be transformed into dignity, into self-respect, into the strength to choose differently. Abaddon looked at the talon of Horus, at the weapon that symbolized everything he had been for 10,000 years. Then he looked at Virgil, at the poet who claimed even the damned could climb. I do not promise transformation, Abaddon said slowly. I do not guarantee I will choose your path, but I will consider it. I will think on whether there might be more honor in attempting redemption than in endlessly repeating damnation. That is all anyone can ask, Virgil replied. The first step from the ninth circle is the hardest, admitting that you are trapped, that your current path leads nowhere but continued suffering. You have taken that step, War Master. The climb begins with a single choice. Virgil faded, his narrative purpose fulfilled, leaving Abaddon alone in his ruined throne room. The War Master stood in silence for 17 hours, his ancient mind processing possibilities he had never allowed himself to consider. And in the eye of terror, the Chaos Gods stirred uneasily, because their greatest champion had just taken the first infinitesimal step toward redemption. And if Abaddon could climb, who else might follow?
The Webway had been the Eldari's greatest achievement, a network of extra-dimensional tunnels spanning the galaxy, insulated from the warp's corruption, allowing instantaneous travel between distant stars. But it had been dying for millennia, collapsing section by section as the fall's aftershocks continued to reverberate through reality. The craft world Aeldari traveled its remaining passages with the desperate care of refugees navigating a crumbling bridge over an infinite abyss. Farseer Eldorath Starbane stood at the terminus of one such passage, deep within the Webway's oldest preserved sections. She had come here following a vision, fragmentary, unclear, but insistent. Something had changed in the monkey's crude immaterium, something that resonated with patterns the Eldari had not sensed since before the fall. Now she understood why. Standing before her, as if he had always been there, was a human in archaic robes, but the psychic resonance emanating from him was impossible. He carried harmonics that predated human civilization, verse structures that echoed the Eldari's own most ancient poetry. "You are the poet," Eldorath said, in flawless Gothic, her melodious voice carrying suspicion and fascination in equal measure. "The monkey who has restructured the Immaterium's chaos into comprehensible patterns. We have felt the changes. We have watched the younger races stumble toward understanding that took our people millennia to achieve, and we wonder, are you salvation, or merely another apocalypse wearing a gentler mask?" Virgil bowed with genuine respect, the gesture of one artist acknowledging another. "I am neither, Farseer. I am a guide, nothing more. But I am glad you have come, because there is something you must understand about what I have done." He gestured at the webway around them, its walls constructed from psychically wrought materials that existed half in real space and half in carefully controlled warp dimension. "Your people already knew the truth I am teaching humanity. You mapped hell long before Dante Alighieri was born. You called it a different name, but you knew." Eldorath's eyes widened, her psychic defenses snapping into place. "No monkey should be able to comprehend our people's history. I am a poet," Virgil interrupted gently. "I recognize patterns in suffering regardless of species. The Eldari's fall, your excess and sensation-seeking, your descent into depravity that birthed Slaanesh, that is the second circle magnified to species-wide catastrophe.
You were the lustful, swept up in storms of experience, unable to stop consuming pleasure until you consumed yourselves. And the sixth circle, the heretics burned in their tombs, that is what you did to the Exodites and craft-world Aeldari who warned against the corruption, who were dismissed as primitive or fearful. The Farseer's composure cracked. 10,000 years of carefully maintained superiority, of Eldari certainty that Monkey could never truly understand their sophisticated civilization, shattered against the simple fact of Virgil's comprehension. He was right. The Eldari had mapped their own damnation in poetry and song, had created elaborate mythologies around their fall, but had always treated it as uniquely Eldari suffering. The possibility that humans might experience the same patterns, might face the same circles of sin and consequence. It was humbling in a way the Eldari had not experienced in millennia. You dare compare your divine comedy to our fall? Eldorath demanded, but her voice lacked heat. We birthed a chaos god through our excess. No human depravity has achieved that. Not yet, Virgil agreed. But give humanity another 10,000 years of the Imperium's current trajectory, and they might. Your fall is humanity's potential future, Farseer. That is why I came to you, to learn from those who have already walked the path I am trying to help humanity avoid. Eldorath studied the human poet with new eyes. Pride demanded she dismiss him, but wisdom, the harsh wisdom purchased through the fall and 10,000 years of barely surviving its consequences, whispered that this might be an opportunity the Eldari could not afford to waste. "What do you wish to know?" she asked finally. "How did you survive?" Virgil replied. "After the fall, after birthing Slaanesh, after losing your empire and scattering to craft worlds and maiden worlds, how did you avoid extinction? More importantly, how did you avoid falling further? You experienced damnation on a species-wide scale. How did you begin to climb?" The question struck at the heart of Eldari identity. Eldorath was silent for a long moment, her mind reaching back through genetic memory, through the shared consciousness of her craft world's infinity circuit, through the collected wisdom of 10,000 years of survival. "We chose structure," she said finally. "The paths, you monkey probably think of them as career choices or warrior traditions, but they are much more. Each path is a way of experiencing emotion, sensation, existence itself in a controlled, structured manner. The path of the warrior channels violence and rage. The path of the seer manages psychic power and foresight. The path of the artisan focuses creative obsession rather than mere consumption." "Purgatorio," Virgil breathed. "You created Purgatorial without naming it. Each path is a terrace of the mountain, a structured way to purge a deadly sin through controlled experience. The warrior purges wrath through disciplined combat. The seer purges pride by accepting visions they cannot change. The artisan purges the lust for sensation through channeling it into creation rather than mere consumption." Eldorath's hands trembled slightly, the only outward sign of the shock reverberating through her consciousness. "You understand. In minutes, you understand what took our greatest philosophers centuries to articulate. Yes, the paths are our salvation. We climb from the second circle not by denying sensation, but by structuring it, by transforming lust for experience into disciplined mastery. But She voice hardened. We still fail. Eldari fall to the path of the outcast, to Kamarag's dark city, to the excess that damned us originally. Our climb is endless, and most fall before reaching the summit. Because you are climbing alone, Virgil said, each craft world isolated, each Eldari on their path separate from their fellows. Dante did not climb Purgatorio alone. He had me as my guide, Beatrice as my inspiration, the examples of other souls struggling alongside him. Isolation makes the climb impossible. You need connection, need to share the burden. You suggest the Eldari and Monkey cooperate? Eldorath laughed, but it was a bitter sound. We who have been dying for 10,000 years while you primitives multiply across our former empire? We who perfected civilization while your ancestors painted caves? You ask too much, poet. I ask only what is necessary, Virgil countered. The Eldari have experience with the climb that humanity lacks. Humanity has numbers and vitality that the Eldari have lost. Together, you could help each other ascend. Separately, you will both eventually fall. The Eldari to extinction, humanity to its own fall that will make yours seem gentler by comparison.
The Farseer's mind raced through probability matrices, through futures branching in infinite directions. In most timelines, the Eldari died slowly, consumed by Slaanesh despite all their precautions. In others, humanity fell to chaos and dragged the galaxy into final damnation. But in a few, a precious, improbable few, there were timelines where cooperation between the species led to something neither could achieve alone. Actual transcendence from the circles of hell. Actual ascent toward something that might be called paradise. What do you propose? Eldaroth asked, the question costing her species' pride dearly. An exchange of knowledge, Virgil replied. The Eldari teach humanity the paths, how to structure dangerous emotions into controlled practice, how to transform vice into discipline. Humanity teaches the Eldari what you have forgotten, how to hope, how to grow, how to believe that the future might be better than endless managed decline. And together you create something new, a shared climb where both species support each other's ascent. The Craft World Councils would never agree, Eldaroth said. The fear of Monkey contamination, the certainty of our superiority. Is pride, Virgil interrupted. The second terrace of Purgatorio, where the proud must crawl on hands and knees beneath heavy stones, learning humility. Perhaps the Eldari's next lesson is precisely this, accepting help from those you consider inferior. Eldaroth wanted to rage against the suggestion, wanted to retreat into 10,000 years of Eldari certainty that Monkey were primitives unworthy of cooperation. But she could not escape the truth of Virgil's words, could not deny that pride had been part of what damned her species originally. The Eldari had been so certain of their sophistication, their superiority, their right to pursue any experience, and that certainty had prevented them from heeding warnings until it was too late. I will bring your proposal to the councils. I promise nothing beyond that. The Eldari are not quick to change. We have survived by maintaining traditions, by following the paths exactly as they have been walked for millennia. Cooperation with Monkey would be unprecedented. All genuine transformation is unprecedented. That is what makes it transformation rather than mere repetition. But I understand your hesitation.
Take this message to your councils. The poet who mapped hell offers alliance to the species who survived their own fall. Together we climb, separately we fall again. Virgil faded from the webway, his narrative purpose fulfilled, leaving Eldaroth alone with her thoughts and the impossible possibility he had presented. She stood for a long time, weighing pride against wisdom, tradition against survival, Aeldari superiority against the poet's undeniable comprehension of her species' deepest truths. Finally, she turned toward the webway passage that would lead back to her craft world. The councils would debate this for years, would resist with every fiber of their proud being. But seeds had been planted, and even the proudest species could learn humility if the alternative was extinction. In the warp, pattern shifted again. Two species who had been enemies since humanity first reached the stars were considering cooperation, not from love or trust, but from shared understanding of damnation and shared hope for ascent. It was a small possibility, but small possibilities, given structure and nurture, could grow into miracles.
The day arrived with neither fanfare nor apocalypse, just the quiet inevitability of transformation reaching its conclusion. Across the galaxy, on 10,000 worlds, in a billion hearts, humanity felt it simultaneously. A choice presenting itself with crystalline clarity. Continue the familiar damnation of endless war, suffering without purpose, loyalty without understanding, or begin the climb. On Cadia's successor fortress world, Kasur Mirak, where the Astra Militarum trained its next generation of defenders, Commissar Helena Vostok stood before her regiment and did something no commissar had done in 10 millennia. She removed her peaked cap, set down her bolt pistol, and spoke not as an enforcer of discipline, but as a human being who had finally understood the nature of her service. "I have executed 147 soldiers for cowardice," she said, her voice carrying across the assembled troops. "I have threatened you with death to maintain discipline. I have been the Emperor's wrath made manifest, and I have been wrong." She paused, letting the shock ripple through the ranks. "Not wrong to maintain order, not wrong to fight humanity's enemies, but wrong in how I understood our purpose. We are not here to die for the Emperor. We are here to transform through service, to take the violence and fear and rage of the Second Circle and purge it through disciplined action. Every battle is a lesson. Every sacrifice is a step upward. We are not fuel for an uncaring machine. We are pilgrims on a journey from damnation toward something better." In the assembled ranks, soldiers who had spent years living in fear of summary execution felt something shift. The grim determination that had sustained them, the certainty that they were already dead, that survival was impossible, that their only value was dying slowly enough to hurt the enemy, began transforming into something more sustainable: purpose, understanding, the realization that their suffering could lead somewhere beyond just more suffering. Private Castor, who had watched his entire squad die on 17 different worlds, raised his hand with the tentative uncertainty of someone breaking 10,000 years of protocol. "Commissar, if we're climbing, where are we climbing to?" Helena smiled, and it was the first genuine smile she had managed in 30 years of service. "Paradise, soldier, not the ecclesiarchy's golden halls or the emperor's side, but the actual paradise, the state of understanding where we fight not from fear or hatred, but from love. Love of humanity, love of the future, love of the possibility that our children might live in a galaxy where endless war is memory rather than destiny."
In Mars, in a newly restructured forges where servitors were being educated rather than lobotomized, Archmagos Deltrion transmitted his findings to the Fabricator General. The experiment had succeeded beyond all projections. Educated workers were not only as efficient as lobotomized slaves, they were more innovative, more adaptable, more capable of solving unexpected problems. The Fourth Circle's lesson had been learned. Generosity and education produced better results than hoarding and exploitation. Requesting permission to expand the educational protocols to all Forge worlds, Deltrion transmitted. The data is conclusive. We have been damning ourselves through false efficiency. The climb from limbo begins with knowledge freely given. In the Eye of Terror, Abaddon the Despoiler stood before the assembled champions of the Black Legion and spoke words that would have been unthinkable mere months ago. I have led 13 Black Crusades and accomplished nothing but confirming our damnation. I have spent 10,000 years trying to justify Horus's betrayal through greater betrayals, and I have been wrong. He paused, his ancient armor creaking as he gestured toward the twisted reality around them. The poet offered me a choice: continue endlessly repeating the sins of the Ninth Circle, or begin the climb toward something else. I have decided to climb. Any who wish to follow me may do so. Any who wish to remain in damnation, you are free to choose differently. The silence that followed was absolute. Then, one by one, champions who had served chaos for millennia stepped forward. Not all of them. Some fled deeper into the Eye of Terror, some laughed at what they saw as weakness, some attacked in rage at the perceived betrayal. But enough stepped forward to matter. Enough chose the possibility of redemption over the certainty of damnation. In the craft world Ulthwé, Eldredeth Starbane stood before the Council of Farseers and presented Virgil's proposal. The debate raged for 3 days, pride and pragmatism warring in the souls of a species that had barely survived its own fall. Finally, the eldest Farseer spoke, her voice carrying the weight of 10,000 years of barely surviving wisdom. "The poet is correct," she said. "Pride was part of what damned us. Pride keeps us from accepting help from those we consider inferior. But if the Monkey can map hell as we once did, if they can structure their climb as we have with the paths, then perhaps they have something to teach us after all. I vote for cooperation." The vote was not unanimous. Half the council opposed, clinging to tradition and superiority, but half supported, and in Aeldari democracy, half was enough to begin. An embassy would be sent to Terra. Knowledge would be exchanged. 2 species would attempt what neither had achieved alone: actual transcendence from the cycles of damnation. And in the Sanctum Imperialis, Virgil and the Emperor stood in communion, psychic and narrative consciousnesses intertwining in ways that bypassed normal communication. They had reached the moment of final decision, the point where the Emperor must choose whether to accept transformation or remain locked in eternal stasis. "I am afraid," the Emperor admitted, and the confession carried 10,000 years of suppressed vulnerability. "I have been the Imperium's foundation for 100 centuries. If I change, if I transform, everything built upon me might collapse. Trillions might die. The species I have suffered to preserve might perish because I chose growth over stability." "Yes," Virgil agreed, refusing to offer false comfort. "That is possible. Transformation is always risky, but continuation of current trajectory guarantees slow death. The Imperium is dying, old friend. Every century it becomes more corrupt, more desperate, more extreme. Without transformation there is only eventual extinction, perhaps in 1,000 years, perhaps in 10,000, but inevitable nonetheless. And with transformation? With transformation there is uncertainty. Some will fall during the climb. Some will reject the journey and sink deeper into damnation. But some, perhaps enough, will ascend, will learn to fight without hatred, to rule without tyranny, to believe without delusion, will become what you always hoped humanity could be, a species that transcended its origins through understanding rather than force.
The Emperor's consciousness expanded, examining probability matrices that would take tech priests centuries to calculate. In most timelines where he remained unchanged, the Imperium eventually fell, to chaos, to Xenos, to its own internal corruption. But in timelines where he accepted transformation, where he released his tyrannical grip and became a teacher rather than a tyrant, in those timelines the outcomes varied wildly. Some led to quick collapse, others led to unprecedented growth. The uncertainty was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. "I choose transformation," the Emperor finally projected, and the words resonated through both real space and the warp with the force of a fundamental decision made by a being who had shaped human history for 40,000 years. "I will begin releasing my control. I will trust humanity to climb without my constant enforcement. And if they fall, if my choice leads to humanity's extinction, then at least they will have fallen while attempting to rise, rather than while locked in stasis." Virgil smiled, tears streaming down his face. "Then my work here is nearly complete. The map is drawn, the structure is imposed, the climb has begun. What happens next depends on humanity's choices, on 10 trillion souls deciding, day by day, whether to ascend or descend." Throughout the Imperium, the change rippled outward. It was not dramatic, no lightning from the heavens, no divine proclamation. Just a subtle shift in the Emperor's light, from commanding brilliance to guiding warmth. The Astronomicon still burned, but it burned with purpose rather than just power. The golden throne still held the Emperor, but it held him as a chrysalis rather than a prison. And on worlds too numerous to count, humans felt it. The possibility of something beyond endless war. Not the end of conflict, not the cessation of struggle, but the transformation of suffering into growth. The climb from hell had begun in earnest. On Terra, in the newly restructured Imperial Palace, the first school opened. Not a schola progenium training warriors, not an administratum scribing endless reports, but an actual school where citizens learned philosophy, literature, art, science, the accumulated wisdom of 40,000 years, freely given rather than jealously hoarded. The first lesson taught in that school was the Divine Comedy. Teachers read Dante's verses to students who had never encountered poetry except in the form of battle hymns. They explained the 9 circles, the 7 terraces, the 9 spheres. They showed how suffering could be understood, structured, and transcended. "This is our map," the teachers said, holding up the ancient text. "This is our journey. We are in hell now, yes. The Imperium is hell made manifest. But hell is not our destiny. It is our starting point. And from hell we climb." In the warp, the chaos gods raged and schemed and adapted to the new reality.
Some of their power had been diminished by Virgil's restructuring, their claims of infinite chaos revealed as merely elaborate sin. But they were not destroyed, not defeated. They were categorized, limited, understood. And understanding meant humanity had weapons they had never possessed before. Beatrice's manifestation appeared one final time in the Sanctum Imperialis. Her form was more solid now, sustained by the hope and love beginning to grow throughout the Imperium. She smiled at the poet who had been her teacher's guide so long ago. "You have done it," she said softly. "You have given them the map. Whether they follow it is now their choice." "Will they?" Virgil asked, suddenly uncertain. "Will humanity choose to climb, or will they reject the difficulty and sink back into familiar damnation? Some will climb, some will fall. Most will do both, ascend for a time, backslide, climb again. That is the nature of transformation. It is not a single choice, but 10 trillion choices made every day by every soul in the galaxy. But you have given them the possibility. That is all any guide can do." Virgil nodded, accepting the truth of her words. His work was complete. The map was drawn. The journey could begin. And across the galaxy, in the hearts of soldiers and priests and workers and outcasts, in the minds of the powerful and the powerless, in the souls of the faithful and the skeptical, humanity began to climb. The Emperor protects, they said, but now they understood what that meant. Not protection through stasis, but protection through growth. Not preservation in amber, but guidance through transformation. Hell had been mapped, Purgatorio had been charted, and paradise, distant but no longer impossible, waited for those brave enough to make the climb. The Divine Comedy had come to Warhammer 40,000, and the galaxy would never be the same.
The story of how Virgil destroyed Warhammer 40,000 is not a story of apocalypse, but of transformation so profound it might as well have been the end of one galaxy and the birth of another. 10 years after the poet's awakening, the Imperium still fought. The soldiers still died. The Forge World still produced weapons. The Inquisition still hunted corruption. But all of it happened with a difference that was subtle yet absolute. They understood why. Every sacrifice was a verse in an epic climbing from damnation. Every battle was a lesson in transcending the circles of sin. Every death was a step on the journey from hell through Purgatorio toward a paradise that grew more visible with each passing day. The casualties of transformation were real and terrible. Worlds that rejected the climb fell to chaos, their populations choosing familiar damnation over uncertain growth. Entire sectors collapsed into civil war as factions debated whether Virgil's teachings were salvation or the most insidious heresy ever devised. The ecclesiarchy fractured, half embracing the Divine Comedy as the ultimate expression of faith, half burning it as corruption that undermined the emperor's divinity. But the victories were equally real. The Dark Mechanicum's defectors, led by Archmagos Deltrion, returned to imperial service with technologies that had seemed forever lost to chaos corruption. They came not as conquerors, but as pilgrims who had climbed from the fourth circle and wished to share what they had learned. Mars accepted them with cautious hope, and the innovations that followed reshaped imperial industry in ways not seen since the Dark Age of technology. The Aeldari embassy to Terra opened trade of knowledge that benefited both species. Humans learned the paths, structured ways to experience dangerous emotions without corruption. The Aeldari learned human adaptability, human hope, human capacity to grow even in the most hostile circumstances. It was not friendship, not yet, but it was cooperation born from mutual understanding of damnation and mutual desire for ascent. The Tyranid High Fleet Pythios completed its experiment. It consumed the barren world it had targeted, incorporated its minimal biomass, and then, impossibly, stopped. The hunger that had driven the Tyranids across galaxies was not satisfied, could never truly be satisfied, but it was acknowledged, understood, transformed from infinite appetite into purposeful consumption. The hive mind began teaching this to its offspring, creating a new strain of Tyranid that consumed to live rather than lived to consume. It would take millennia for this change to spread through the entire species, but the first step had been taken. And Abaddon, Ezekiel Abaddon, who had been Horus's companion and Chaos's champion, stood on the border between the Eye of Terror and real space and broadcast a message that echoed through both dimensions. "I was Kano's prince," he said, his voice stripped of the fury that had sustained him for 10,000 years. "I betrayed the Father who made me, followed the Lord who fell, and spent 10 millennia trying to justify damnation through greater damnation. But I have seen the map. I understand my sin, and I choose to climb." He raised the talon of Horus, that weapon that had struck the Emperor himself, and cast it into the Eye of Terror, watching it vanish into the warp storms. "I am no longer the War Master. I am no longer Chaos's champion. I am a pilgrim on the journey from the Ninth Circle. And to any who would join me, the path is long, the climb is difficult, but it is possible. Even the damned can ascend if they choose to." Not all followed him. Most of the Black Legion remained in the Eye of Terror, choosing familiar corruption over uncertain redemption. But some, a few hundred, a few thousand, stepped forward. They would spend centuries, perhaps millennia, purging their corruption through the terraces of Purgatorio. Most would fail. But some would succeed, and those few would become something the galaxy had never seen. Chaos Space Marines who chose transformation over damnation. On Terra, the Emperor began his own transformation. Slowly, carefully, he released his tyrannical grip on the Imperium's every function. The Astronomican continued burning, but it burned with the willing sacrifice of psychers who understood their purpose rather than forced fuel. The psychic defenses of Terra remained strong, but they were maintained by distributed consciousness rather than singular will. The Emperor, who had ruled as Tyrant Father God, began the long, agonizing process of becoming what he should have been from the beginning, a teacher. It hurt more than 10,000 years of burning on the Golden Throne, because transformation always hurts more than stasis. Growth requires tearing down what you were to become what you might be. The Emperor had built his identity on control, on preserving humanity through force, on holding together an empire through sheer will. Now he had to learn to trust, to guide without commanding, to teach without controlling. Virgil watched this transformation with the satisfaction of a guide who sees his student finally understanding the lesson.
On the day the Emperor spoke his first words in 10,000 years, not psychic projection, but actual speech, his withered lips forming words with agonizing effort, Virgil knew his work was complete. "Thank you," the Emperor whispered, the words barely audible through the Golden Throne's machinery, "for showing me that hell was not eternal." "Thank you," Virgil replied, "for choosing to climb." And then, with the quiet inevitability of a story reaching its natural conclusion, Virgil began to fade. His form grew translucent, his presence less certain. He had been an idea made manifest, the idea that suffering could be understood and therefore transcended. Now that idea had taken root in humanity's collective consciousness, he was no longer necessary in physical form. "Will you return?" the custodian captain asked, surprising himself with the question. He had spent months watching the poet reshape reality, had grown accustomed to Virgil's presence, had perhaps even begun to trust him. "I am always here," Virgil replied, his voice echoing from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. "Every time a human soul understands the structure of their damnation, every time someone chooses to climb rather than sink, every time suffering is transformed into growth, I am there. I am the map. I am the guide. I am the possibility of ascent. And I will remain as long as humanity needs me." Beatrice appeared one final time, standing beside the fading poet. She too was becoming translucent, her manifestation sustained by the hope and love beginning to grow in humanity's collective consciousness. She smiled at Virgil with infinite tenderness.
"Come," she said, extending her hand. "Our work here is done. Let them climb on their own now. We have shown the way." Virgil took her hand, and together they faded into the light of the Astronomican, becoming part of the beacon itself. Future navigators would feel their presence in the singing void, two guides who walked beside every ship traversing the warp, showing the way from hell through purgatory toward paradise. The galaxy continued its eternal war, but it was no longer a war without meaning, no longer suffering without purpose. Humanity fought with understanding now, died with comprehension, served with knowledge of where their service led. They were climbing, slowly, painfully, with countless setbacks and failures, but they were climbing. And at the summit of Purgatorio, visible now to those with the vision to see it, paradise waited. Not as a distant reward for the faithful, not as a myth to sustain the despairing, but as an actual destination that could be reached through transformation and growth. The spheres of paradise, the moon, Mercury, Venus, the sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, the fixed stars, and finally the Imperium itself, all of them mapped and made navigable by a poet who understood that even in the grim darkness of the far future, hope was possible if humanity chose to climb. Virgil had not destroyed Warhammer 40,000. He had transformed it from hell into a journey through hell. And that transformation, that simple yet profound shift from endless suffering to purposeful purgation, was more devastating to the forces of damnation than any weapon, more powerful than any army, more enduring than any empire. Because understanding once achieved cannot be unachieved. The map once seen cannot be unseen.
and humanity, having glimpsed the path from damnation to paradise, would never again accept that hell was their permanent destiny. The Emperor protects, they still said, but now they understood. He protects not through walls and weapons, but through teaching. Not through preservation in stasis, but through guidance toward transformation. Not as a tyrant demanding sacrifice, but as a teacher showing the way to climb. In the grim darkness of the far future, there was still only war. But now there was also something else, something that had been missing for 10,000 years. There was a map. There was a guide. There was the possibility of paradise. And that possibility, more than any army or weapon, would determine whether humanity survived the eternal darkness, or finally learned to create its own light. The Divine Comedy had come to the 41st millennium, and whether it ended in tragedy or triumph would depend on 10 trillion choices yet to be made. But at least now, humanity had the choice. And choice, as Virgil had taught them, was what separated the damned from the ascending, the trapped from the climbing, hell from purgatorio to paradise. The Emperor protects, but humanity climbs. And in the space between protection and ascent, miracles become possible.
No, Virgil corrected. I have made your beacon into what it always should have been. A demonstration that suffering can lead to transcendence rather than just more suffering. For 10,000 years, the Imperium has told its citizens that death in the Emperor's service is the highest honor. But you never showed them what that honor meant beyond propaganda and empty words. Now they see. Death in service is not just sacrifice, but transformation. Not just ending, but beginning. The chamber fell silent except for the singing, the beautiful, terrible, profound singing of souls burning their way toward paradise. Tech priests who had spent centuries maintaining the Astronomican without truly understanding what they maintained found themselves weeping through augmetic tear ducts they had not used in decades. Choir Master Gaineth, who had coordinated the deaths of tens of thousands with bureaucratic efficiency, suddenly saw each death as a soul's journey rather than a resource expenditure. And throughout the Imperium, on ships navigating the warp, in temples where the faithful prayed, in barracks where soldiers prepared for battle, humanity felt the change. The Emperor's light had always guided them through darkness, but now it also showed them where they were going, not just physically through the warp, but spiritually through the circles of their own damnation toward eventual paradise. On the golden throne, the Emperor experienced something he had not felt in 10 millennia: genuine surprise. Virgil had accomplished in months what the Emperor had failed to achieve in 40,000 years. He had given humanity's suffering actual meaning. Not the false meaning of propaganda or the coerced meaning of religious dogma, but the deep structural meaning that came from understanding one's place in a cosmic journey from hell through purgatorio to paradise. "What have you done?" the Emperor asked, and the question carried not accusation, but wonder. "I have taught the Astronomican to sing the canticles of Purgatorio. I have transformed your beacon from mere navigation aid into spiritual education.
Every soul that burns here now teaches every navigator, every astropath, every psychically sensitive human in the galaxy what the climb looks like. They are your testament, old friend, proof that even the most terrible suffering can lead to transcendence if it is understood rather than merely endured. "And what of me?" the Emperor asked quietly. "I have burned for 100 centuries. I have suffered beyond any soul's capacity to imagine. Where is my transcendence? Where is my climb?" "It begins now," Virgil said, his voice infinitely gentle. "You have held humanity together through sheer tyrannical will, suffering endlessly to preserve a species that you simultaneously loved and controlled. But preservation is not growth. Stasis is not salvation. You must choose. Remain frozen on the golden throne, forever holding back chaos through agony, or accept transformation. Accept that your suffering can lead somewhere beyond mere endurance." "I cannot leave the throne," the Emperor projected. "If I do, the Astronomicon fails, Terra falls, the Imperium collapses, humanity dies." "Not if the transformation is done correctly," Virgil countered. "The Astronomicon sings now without or with your direct control. The Psychers understand their purpose and give themselves willingly to the climb. The beacon is no longer sustained by your tyrannical will alone, but by their collective transformation. You could, slowly, carefully, begin to release your grip, begin to transform from the Emperor of mankind into something else, something you were always meant to be." "What?" the Emperor asked, and the single word carried 10,000 years of desperate hope. "A teacher," Virgil said simply. "Not a tyrant, not a god, not even a father. A teacher who guides humanity through the climb rather than forcing them to remain in stasis. You tried control, and it failed. You tried sacrifice, and it only perpetuated suffering. Perhaps it is time to try education, to show rather than command, to guide rather than rule." The Emperor's consciousness withdrew into deep contemplation. Around them the Astronomicon continued its new song, the song of souls ascending, of suffering transformed into growth, of damnation becoming the first step toward paradise. And in the warp, something unprecedented began to occur. The patterns Virgil had imposed, the 9 circles, the terraces of Purgatorio, the structure of the Divine Comedy, began to solidify into something more permanent than mere conceptual framework. They became fundamental architecture of the Imperium itself, laws that even chaos gods would have to acknowledge. Hell had been mapped, purgatory had been charted, and now, finally, Paradise's first sphere was beginning to become visible through the eternal darkness. The transformation was nearly complete, but the hardest part remained: getting humanity to actually choose the climb. The Astronomican sang differently now. Where once it had been a psychic scream, 1,000 souls burning per day to create a beacon of light in the warp, it had become something more complex, more musical. The dying Psychers still suffered, still gave their lives to fuel the Emperor's lighthouse, but their deaths had acquired meaning beyond mere sacrifice. They were no longer just fuel. They were verses in an epic poem that was rewriting itself across the galaxy. Virgil stood in the chamber of the Astronomicon, surrounded by the golden machinery and psychic wards that channeled dying consciousness into navigable light.
The tech priests who maintained the systems watched him with a mixture of awe and terror. No unauthorized person had entered this sanctum in 10,000 years, but Virgil had simply walked past every defense, every ward, every failsafe, as if doors and walls were suggestions rather than absolute barriers. "You should not be here," Choir Master Ganeth said, his voice amplified through vox units that helped him coordinate the endless rotation of psychers feeding the beacon. "This is the most sacred space in the Imperium. The Emperor's light is agony without purpose," Virgil interrupted gently, placing his hand on the nearest psychic conduit. Through his touch, he felt the screaming consciousness of a young woman from some agri-world, her potential recognized at age 12, her life spent in training for this moment, the moment she would burn to light humanity's path through the warp. Her name was Thessia. She loved gardens. She wanted to make things grow. Instead, she burns, and no one even remembers her name after she's consumed. "Her sacrifice saves billions," Ganeth protested, but his voice lacked conviction. He had witnessed tens of thousands of deaths in his centuries of service. He had stopped seeing them as individual souls long ago, had learned to view them as resources, as fuel units necessary for the Imperium's survival. "Yes," Virgil agreed, "but sacrifice without meaning is just waste. These psychers could die knowing their suffering serves a greater purpose, understanding that their pain is not random but structured, that their deaths are verses in an epic poem that was rewriting itself across the galaxy." Virgil stood in the chamber of the Astronomican, surrounded by the golden machinery and psychic wards that channeled dying consciousness into navigable light. The tech priests who maintained the systems watched him with a mixture of awe and terror. No unauthorized person had entered this sanctum in 10,000 years, but Virgil had simply walked past every defense, every ward, every failsafe, as if doors and walls were suggestions rather than absolute barriers. "You should not be here," Choir Master Ganeth said, his voice amplified through vox units that helped him coordinate the endless rotation of psychers feeding the beacon. "This is the most sacred space in the Imperium. The Emperor's light is agony without purpose," Virgil interrupted gently, placing his hand on the nearest psychic conduit. Through his touch, he felt the screaming consciousness of a young woman from some agri-world, her potential recognized at age 12, her life spent in training for this moment, the moment she would burn to light humanity's path through the warp. Her name was Thessia. She loved gardens. She wanted to make things grow. Instead, she burns, and no one even remembers her name after she's consumed. "Her sacrifice saves billions," Ganeth protested, but his voice lacked conviction. He had witnessed tens of thousands of deaths in his centuries of service. He had stopped seeing them as individual souls long ago, had learned to view them as resources, as fuel units necessary for the Imperium's survival. "Yes," Virgil agreed, "but sacrifice without meaning is just waste. These psychers could die knowing their suffering serves a greater purpose, understanding that their pain is not random but structured, that their deaths are verses in an epic poem that was rewriting itself across the galaxy." Virgil closed his eyes and his consciousness expanded through the Astronomican's network, touching each dying soul, each burning mind, and to each one he whispered the same truth. "You are not just dying, you are ascending.
Your suffering is the sixth terrace of Purgatorio, where those who lusted for power, psychic power, the ability to touch the warp, must purge that desire through fire. But fire that purges is not the same as fire that merely consumes. Understand this, and your death becomes transformation. Throughout the chamber, the dying psychers felt it, a shift from meaningless agony to purposeful purgation. They were still dying, still burning, still suffering, but now they understood why. They were not just keeping the Astronomican lit, they were transforming their own souls through the very act of sacrifice, climbing from whatever circle they had occupied in life towards something higher, something pure. The Astronomican's light changed. Navigators across the galaxy noticed it immediately. The beacon that had always been steady but painful, like staring into a sun, became steady and beautiful, like watching a sunrise. The psychic scream that guided ships through the warp acquired harmonics, structure, verse. On the bridge of the merchant vessel Merciful Prophet, Navigator Cassian gasped as his third eye opened and he saw the Astronomican truly for the first time in his 300-year career. "It's singing," he whispered. "The Emperor's light is singing, and the song is the Divine Comedy," his captain supplied, having heard reports from Terra about the poet's restructuring of reality. "Virgil has reached the Astronomican. He's teaching it to sing." Back in the chamber, Choir Master Ganeth fell to his knees, overwhelmed by what he was witnessing. The psychers, who had been merely screaming in agony, were now impossibly experiencing something that might be called peace. Not the peace of cessation, or the peace of drugs dulling their pain, but the peace that comes from understanding that suffering serves a purpose beyond mere endurance. "How?" Ganeth asked through tears. "How can death be peaceful when they are still burning?" "Because they know what comes after," Virgil replied. "I have shown them that death is not ending, but transition. The sixth terrace of Purgatorio burns away the lust for power. They desired psychic ability, desired to touch the warp, desired to be more than baseline human. That desire, left unchecked, would have led to corruption, to sorcery, to demon binding, to the Eighth Circle's fraud. But by burning here, by giving their power to light humanity's path through the warp, they purge that desire and ascend. They die not as fuel, but as pilgrims completing their journey." He turned to the Emperor, whose presence saturated the chamber like a golden fog, and the words carried complex emotions: resistance, recognition, reluctant acceptance. "You have made my beacon into a church," the Emperor projected, and the emotions carried complex meaning: resistance, recognition, reluctant acceptance.